Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rachel Rees toku ingoa, ko Roti koro mātua whakatū. No mai haere mai, welcome to our members of the Joint Committee, tēnā koe, Mayor King, councillors, Tasman District Councillor here with us in the Chamber in Richmond. Welcome to elected members who are joining us on Zoom, and to our staff also. Tēnā koe, Aina, who is joining us. Aina was a member of the Future Development Strategy Subcommittee, and to also tēnā koe to Mike Wakefield, who is a partner at Simpson Gresson, who will be addressing our hui shortly. I'm going to open today with karakia, and then I'll run through some Zoom protocols. So just today I will open with karakia. Kia tau mai te maramatanga, kia tau mai te rangimārie e, kia tau mai te kaha me te aroha mō tēnei kaupapa, haumi e, hui e, tae ki e, kia ora, welcome. So we are having this meeting in a combined model today with some of us in person in the chamber at Tasman District and some on Zoom. That does make it a little bit more complicated for both running the Zoom function and chairing. So I really encourage those of you who are on Zoom to use your hand up function if you wish to speak. We will be using the tick function for those of you on Zoom when it comes to voting, tick and cross. And in the council chamber, what I'll do is, rather than using voices, I'll just ask as we get to voting that if you could just put your hand up at the same time as saying aye or no, and then I've just got a better indication of numbers. For those of us in the chamber, we'll just be mindful of using our microphones and turning those on and off as we go through the day so that you can be heard on the members on Zoom and staff on Zoom can hear our feedback. I have an apology today from Councillor Gail Noonan, who's unable to attend the meeting due to flight disruptions. So I will move that we accept her apology. Do I have a seconder for? Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bryant is seconding. So I'll just do the first vote to accept the apology. All those in favour? Aye. Aye. That looks like that is carried. Governance advisors that you're watching that, you can see what's happening. So if you feel that I'm going a little bit early with carrying the vote, just signal and I'll pause just to count the numbers if we get to a close vote. So that is apologies accepted. The order of business today is as set out on your agenda sheet. Just a reminder, if anyone has any declarations that they want the meeting to be aware of, could you signal now? So just pop your hand up if there's a declaration of interest that we need to be aware of. Councillor Bryant. Just one from myself in relation to T108 at Wakefield. It was an adjoining property currently under trustee executor of the estate. Thank you. Anyone else on Zoom? No, I can't see anyone else with an interest. Deputy Mayor Eager, I did notice you had your hand up. Was that with a procedural question about them?
I was just wondering who was in the chambers, just because I can only see who's on Zoom. I just don't know who's at the meeting.
All right, we'll do a round of introductions in a moment. I think that would be useful because then you'll know which staff are here as well, because you won't be able to see them even if you can get your special magnifying glasses on to see who's around the council table. So I'll come to that in just a moment. Just in terms of the process for today, I haven't received any requests for public forum. Robin, nothing's come in? No, all right, so there's no public forum. And the process today for the meeting is we're going to hear from Mike Wakefield. Mike is on a very tight time frame today. He's stepped out on an Environment Court matter. So if you don't mind, Councillor Edgar, I'm going to do the introductions after we hear from Mike because he has only got a short period of time that he can be here for. Then we'll do the introductions and then we'll go to the introduction of the officer's report. So tēnā koe, Mike, welcome to the meeting and thank you for joining us. I understand you've got a PowerPoint that you're going to speak to, so we'll just get that loaded up.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll just hang on just a second. Right. Now, thank you very much for having me here. as the Mayor mentioned, I am on a slightly compressed timetable. I think I'll need to be wrapped up here by about 2:15 so that I can whip back down the hill into the Environment Court. I've been asked to say a few words today about the future development strategy as a policy document, what that means, what the process is about to try and get to this point, and provide a little bit of guidance on the LGA decision-making requirements and indeed some risks that arise when making decisions of this nature. So we do have some PowerPoint slides which are being presented on the screen today. Those 4 points sort of broadly capture what I'll be speaking about. And I'm happy to take questions about anything that I do say today, either on the way through or afterwards as well. What I might need to do though for those in the chamber is to just keep an eye on where there are questions, because I might miss the little hand that pops up during the Zoom session.
Mike,
So
that's right. I'll keep an eye on that. And so what will happen is that people in the chamber will signal, those on Zoom will put their hand up, and then we'll try, and if there's a lot of questions, we'll take some breaks as you go through. If there's only one or two, we might hold it to the end. We'll see how we go. Thank
Fantastic. You. All right, well, if we can just move on to the first slide, please. What is an FDS? Now, we've set out some high-level comments on this particular slide, which try to capture and explain what the FDS is about. It's a document that's required under Part 6 of, well, it was prepared under Part 6 of the Local Government Act, but it's in order to meet the requirements of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. Now, the National Policy Statement on Urban Development has been around since about 2016 in two different forms. There was the 2016 version, which also required that an FDS be developed by local authorities, but that was replaced in 2020 with a new set of provisions which also require that same outcome. Now, the FDS, we've described it there as a high-level strategy document. It's required to do two specific things by the updated NPS. Set out a growth pattern that achieves a well-functioning urban environment, on the one hand, and the second aspect is to provide sufficient development capacity. And the NPS talks about three temporal periods, being short-term, medium, and long-term. But what the FDS is required to do is provide for sufficient development capacity over the next 30 years to meet the expected demand that various districts and regions will be facing. Now, what does that all mean? Well, that requires councils, when they're preparing these FDSs, to understand first what the capacity requirements are and what that means in practice, and then identify broad locations in which this development capacity is going to be provided over the long term, as well as all of the necessary infrastructure that's going to be required to support and service that development capacity and future residents of those areas. Alongside that, there is also a specific requirement to consider constraints on development, which of course will adjust and alter and cause a need to respond to where those residential development or business development is located. Coming back to that first point that we made there, the requirement to achieve a well-functioning urban environment, that is a defined term in the National Policy Statement, and it's important that you understand that. Policy 1 of the National Policy Statement defines well-functioning urban environment as meaning environments that meet the needs of the future population. And when we say needs, we mean in terms of price points, the type of housing, and also the location of housing. So there's a number of different parameters there which tie into that issue. Well-functioning urban environments enable Māori to express cultural traditions and norms. They enable a variety of sites suitable for different business sectors. They're accessible, so requirement is to have good accessibility between housing, jobs, community services, and open spaces. And that's by way of public and also active transport means. Well-functioning urban environments are designed and required to support and limit adverse impacts on the competitive operation of housing markets. And then there's also this requirement to support reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and to be resilient to impacts of climate change. So the long and short of it is that there's a number of different components which feature when you're determining what is a well-functioning urban environment, and multiple issues that have to be considered. Now, you'll see that in the report, which forms part of this agenda, there's a useful explanation of the sorts of input that the councils and the subcommittee have received in terms of preparing this FDS. And they all come back to these various criteria which pin back what the FDS is required to achieve. In terms of the evidence base, FDSs around the country, they're all being prepared at the same sort of time at the moment, and they're required to be informed by the the development capacity assessments that underpin this, as well as any existing long-term plans and infrastructure strategies which are already in existence. Now, this feature, and in fact all of the criteria which I've just referenced, they sort of distinguish an FDS from just a true high-level policy document. It's a policy document that has a specific purpose, a specific need for content, and it's also informed by a range of multifaceted and complex input that needs to be given a degree of weight when making decisions. Now, why is the FDS important? I'm hoping that's going to be fairly self-explanatory and I don't need to talk to it too much. But it is important because urban growth has to be aligned and integrated with infrastructure planning and funding decisions, and it needs to be strategic over the medium term and long term. The NPSUD in 2016 was introduced by the government at that time as part of its urban growth agenda to try and bring back and constrain the ad hoc and sporadic development that we've experienced across many years around the country. And that is what the FDS here is about. It's about trying to provide some clarity for the resident population as to where they can expect to see development happen, but also provide some clarity around how growth is going to happen so that it satisfies the population growth that's anticipated. So the FDS, once it's adopted, won't operate in a silo. It's part of a suite of documents, and they all work in tandem to either spatially identify locations where development will be provided in the future, but then also how to service those areas of development as well. Now, I'm just having a look at the slides here. The FDS is going to be a living document. It's important to note that. Under the National Policy Statement, the FDS has to be adopted, but then it has to be reviewed every 3 years. And it's not just a review on a whim. It needs to be informed by the same robust evidence that is used first time round. The capacity assessments also need to be reviewed by councils on a progressive basis so that they provide the evidence base around what demand exists, what needs exist, and also relate to the population growth that's expected. Now, these provisions in the NPS ensure that the FDS remains current and that doesn't fall out of sync. But what that means is the FDS is not locked in now in perpetuity. There might be aspects of it that don't fundamentally change, and indeed, they might well be developed areas. But for those greenfield areas, there's no guarantee that they might not change if additional constraints are identified, or in fact, the need for development changes over time so that land isn't going to be required. Now, let's jump across to that next slide, I think. Thank you. Now, the FDS is a strategy document for decision makers, and they have to have regard to it when they're preparing later documents. Now, this slide here demonstrates how the hierarchy under the RMA works. And so you've got the RMA sitting at the top, national policy statement sitting underneath it, the requirement to develop a future development strategy, and that strategy itself is then going to inform the development of other plans and strategies by local authorities. And in this case, you'll have your long-term plans, climate change action plans, but also your resource management plan reviews. And the FDS itself is going to be used as well, not just through the entire plan review process, but also through plan change requests, which developers and other landowners might put in. That document there, in fact, works in reverse when the FDS is being developed, where you have your existing plans and strategies that inform the content of the FDS as well. But we don't need to spend too much time talking about that point. Now, the next slide. So we have here wire combined FDS, and you'll see that the second line there is highlighted yellow. The comment there was both Nelson and region and Tasman are experiencing high population growth. Just want to correct that. It's not Nelson. Nelson isn't experiencing high growth in the same way as Tasman. It's the region as a whole which is experiencing high growth. and your experts in the room and your officers will be best placed to explain the approach taken by the FDS. But my understanding is that the FDS has been developed in a scenario that anticipates some high growth in the future, and designed to ensure, quite appropriately in my view, that there is sufficient development capacity to be available for 30 years. Now, under the NPSUD, Nelson and Tasman are Tier 2 local authorities that share jurisdiction over the same Tier 2 urban environment. The former NPS, this is the 2016 version, recognised that there were going to be local authorities that shared jurisdiction or were responsible for regulating urban environments that got close to or even crossed some boundaries. And what it did is it encouraged strongly that local authorities that share jurisdiction collaborate and cooperate to reach agreement on the content of a capacity assessment first, but then also specifying minimum targets for growth and producing a joint future development strategy. The updated NPS, the 2020 version, has made that more directive. Policy 3.12 of that document now reads, if more than one Tier 1 or Tier 2 local authority has jurisdiction over an urban environment, which is the case here, those local authorities are jointly responsible for preparing an FDS as required by this subpart. So the directive nature of that provision is pretty clear. It's directing that the councils that share jurisdiction are collectively responsible for meeting that requirement to prepare an FDS, and collectively responsible for developing that document in order to buy into a joint approach to enabling growth. Now, why is this a good thing, you might ask? As I've already mentioned in my previous couple of slides, joint approaches to dealing with matters like urban growth mean that you've then got an informed and an integrated basis to prepare your strategic infrastructure planning and funding decisions that will flow from the FDS. If, for example, and this is obviously hypothetical, if, for example, there was no direction to jointly prepare or even cooperate or collaborate, then the risk is that you have these different councils operating in silos, trying to manage growth over what is effectively the same urban environment. And that creates tension and pushing and pulling between the resource management plans that will flow out of these documents. So in this context, we have this meeting here today, which is the Joint Committee, Nelson Tasman. And it's the Joint Committee that has been given the delegated ability to make the decisions on the recommendations from the subcommittee. Now, this approach aligns with the NPS expectations that councils that share jurisdiction are to jointly prepare an FDS. And so it's on that basis that things are proceeding here today. Sorry. Now, the next slide, please. Right, so what's happened to get to this point? The reference there at the top of the page is to the SCP. Now that's the Special Consultative Procedure under the Local Government Act. I'd like to think that that's fairly well understood, so I'm not in a position where I have to describe that in too much detail. But the requirement in the NPS 2020 is to use that when developing a future development strategy. And you'll be familiar with what's happened to get to this point. The SCP process provides public with the ability to make submissions and to then have those be given due consideration. Now, the question of scope was discussed several weeks ago, I believe, at a workshop meeting. And we made the comment that it is implicit in using a special consultative procedure that a proposal could evolve or change from what was originally put out for consultation. And we say that because it's not the case that you notify something in a fixed form that can't be adjusted. The SCP does provide for input from the public, requires that input and feedback is considered and evaluated, and then the recommendations flow from that. And that's the situation the Joint Committee is in here. The subcommittee was tasked with hearing submissions, considering those, and then coming to a view on what the FDS should contain and where it should direct that growth happens or does not. So in that context, the SCP does provide a process by which submitters can have their views tested, and councils must then approach their decision making in light of the recommendations received, but with an open mind that those are, in fact, the best recommendations on the table. In order to be fair to submitters who were involved in the process and chose to participate, or those that didn't, there are limitations on the extent to which changes can be made, and this flows from the natural justice principles. Now, what I'm alluding to there is that it's not fair and in accordance with natural justice for decisions to be made that go beyond the scope of what was originally put out for consultation. Now, while this often involves material questions of degree or materiality of change, the risk is that if you do make decisions or want to depart from recommendations in quite a significant way, that could potentially create risk and expose the council to judicial review. Decision makers should make sure that they are considering scope and be aware of the nature of the process that they're in, because if they do decide to make submissions that weren't anticipated or could not reasonably have been anticipated, this creates risk of challenge. And I mean, speaking fairly frankly here, that risk should be avoided. The best approach is to shy away from that as much as possible. Now, the SCP is all about enabling feedback and enabling a response to that feedback. And so in terms of the scope issue, changes to any proposal that arise through an SCP should fairly arise out of the submissions received by the body hearing those submissions. And that comes back to the fundamental purpose of the SCP. It's to provide a mechanism for persons to be able to influence proposals before the decision is made. Now, just looking at my notes here. I think we're safe to move on to the next slide now, thank you. Now, what are the decision-making requirements? The report that's on the agenda does provide some discussion around the decision-making options, but at a high level, the FDS decision-making is required to comply with Part 6 of the Local Government Act, and that includes the general consultation requirements and principles. The nature and purpose of the FDS is going to be relevant when making decisions, and we've talked about this. While it is a high-level policy document, the recommendations and indeed the content of the FDS is informed by multifaceted expert input and advice, and that must be given some weight. It's an important aspect of the FDS that does distinguish it from just your standard high-level policy document. Now, the decision-making options I've mentioned, if you refer to pages 32 and 33 of the agenda report, there's some sound advice and observations in there around what decision-making options exist and what that might mean. And in my third bullet point on the slide here, I've outlined here some do's in terms of the decision-making process, but I'm going to take the opportunity here to also outline some don'ts as well. So we've got here on the screen in the bullet points, if the committee were to depart from recommendations, it must do all of these things, and there's 5 bullet points on screen. Now these all relate to the FDS, but they also flow out of the decision-making requirements in the LGA. The first is that there's a requirement to be appropriately informed of any relevant submissions. Now this comes back to the scope discussion that I made earlier, but also the natural justice principles. Flowing from that also is in having an adequate understanding of community views and preferences. Now this is a requirement of the SCP, but also importantly the requirement in Part 6 of the LGA. Third one on the list there is determine that its decisions will deliver a future development strategy that accords with the MPSUD. Now the content is pretty prescriptive about what an FDS needs to contain, and if you were to make a decision that doesn't achieve that set of criteria or that set of content, then you're not delivering an FDS that is satisfying what the MPSUD does require. There is a need to provide reasons for its decisions, and in this context, I note that the recommendations from the subcommittee do provide some fairly significant explanation for why they've landed on the particular recommendations that they have. And then finally, not undermining the overall integrity of the FDS or the achievement of its overall objective for the Nelson Tasman urban environment. Now, this is really important because an FDS does form part of a policy environment that can be quite complex in places, and it will be leveraged and attempted to be used by landowners and developers from the date of adoption moving forward. So I mentioned earlier that these are some of the do's, but I'm going to flip it on its head and talk about some don'ts as well. And as I mentioned, the FDS is a document that will exist. It's not something that's just going to sit on a shelf and be ignored. It is used to inform growth planning, strategic planning, and infrastructure decision making. It does serve an important purpose, frequently relied on through plan change reviews, plan change appeals, rezoning requests, and even subdivision proposals. And look, I've been involved in a number of situations over the past year or so where spatial plans and FDSs have been used in that way to try and support development in places and in locations that were not anticipated in those FDSs. So departures from recommendations, I'm going to provide some advice on this front because departures from recommendations can create risk to the decision-making body. Now, the first point here to make is that often local authorities are in situations where independent panels or joint committees or subcommittees are the ones that have the responsibility for hearing submissions and then providing recommendations. And it sets up a two-stage process where you have the recommendation body at one level and then the substantive decision maker at the next. Now, that's a distinction that needs to be given some weight. And while the recommendation making body is simply providing recommendations, they commonly provide the recommendations alongside having heard the submissions, obtained the expert input, and provided some detailed reasons in support of those. The general expectation is that the decision maker in that context will respect those recommendations and indeed respect the fact that it was the subcommittee, in this case, that heard the submissions and made those recommendations to it. I note that the decision maker is not expected to be an effective rubber stamp in all cases, but coming back to what's on the screen there, if there is any intent or desire to depart from recommendations, you need to make sure that you're doing it in a way that still ticks off all of those boxes and leads to a decision that is safe and robust. I mentioned already scope considerations. You must be aware of the scope limitations that exist so that you are according with natural justice principles. And in that respect, the Joint Committee is, I know, has had fairly good availability to the submissions that have been presented through the SCP, but they don't have the benefit of having heard all of the discussions that happened through the hearing process. I just flag that point. That might be different for certain members of the Joint Committee, but it's something that's going to be relevant for the decision-making process. Now, these particular risks that I've talked about could conceivably generate judicial risk challenge if you go beyond scope or if you make decisions in a way that doesn't align with what was raised through the hearing process, then that can create some JR risk because you're leading to a decision which was not anticipated. The other risk with departure is that you engage a merits risk, and it's a merits risk that could be advanced through judicial review or through later processes. And what the first one of those is the failure to achieve an FDS that maintains its overall integrity. And the reason I'm raising this is I'm actually in Queenstown at the moment arguing about a number of rezoning appeals. And one of the issues that's being raised there is the developers or would-be developers are trying to rely on a spatial plan and question its illogicality or its failure to provide a cohesive message on what is integrated development across the next 30 years. And the reason they're able to do that is that when this particular spatial plan was developed, they obtained expert input on a range of factors, but in others, when they were extending out into the future, they didn't place as much reliance in certain areas on the expert input. And what that means is it undermines the strength of that document in terms of being developed in reliance on robust expert-led input that assess the relevant criteria. So the danger there is that if you depart from recommendations and adopt a decision that doesn't accord with some of the expert input or the recommendations of the subcommittee, then it could be perceived as creating a weakness in the logic of the FDS and the growth pattern that's been promulgated. And that weakness, or any weakness, is going to be relied on at a later date, potentially through district plan reviews or indeed through plan change appeals. And so my suggestion there is that it's to the benefit of these councils to ensure that where things land with this FDS, is an FDS that tells a consistent story and retains its internal integrity. Now, finally, process risk. The MPS does set some timeframes for the preparation of these future development strategies. And if there are going to be significant changes or any amendments to it, that could well push out those timeframes before it's ready for adoption. Now, that's a process risk. The other risk is that if, and we've seen this, I think, in one location around the country, if there's any appetite or disagreement between councils in terms of an FDS, it's simply illogical to end up with two different FDSs being adopted where you're dealing with the same urban environment. As I mentioned earlier, it creates internal tension, it creates a risk of challenge, and it's not setting in train one simple strategic urban pattern that can then be used to inform the long-term funding and planning decisions of the various councils. That is the end of the slides, and so I am now free to answer any questions if I have any.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much for the presentation. Yes, I can see a question signalled on the screen from Councillor Sensen, and then I'll go to the chamber after I take questions from the screen. Councillor Sensen, tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe. Thank you, Madam Mayor, through the chair. Kia ora, Mike. Thanks very much for that. I've got three questions really. My first one is in relation to the slide where it had the highlighted line about the growth assumptions for Nelson and Tasman. I'm assuming that as coming from Simpson Gresson, you are a lawyer and presenting kind of legal advice or kind of a legal perspective. And I'm just wondering, whether it would be relevant to actually update that slide so that it was accurate around the growth patterns. Like I'm reflecting on the population projections that were presented to council for our inclusion in the AMPS and long-term plan that shows that the population projections adjusted for the 2019 population estimate have Nelson at a low population growth up until about 2034, almost 2035, and then beyond that they go above the medium. So I'm just concerned that we, I guess, are being presented with something that isn't actually accurate in terms of Nelson's growth projections.
Look, fair observation. I'm not proposing that my slide substitutes for any of the capacity assessment information that the FDS has been developed to work in tandem with. I mean, a better way to pitch that may well be, I suspect the office will be a better place to discuss this. Better way to express that second bullet point would be to say the region as a whole is experiencing high growth. But again, I think it's the officers that will be a better place to talk that. As a legal advisor, certainly accuracy is better, but I'm going to defer to their involvement. They've been much closer to the capacity assessment numbers than I have.
Thanks, Mike, and I'll cover that when they present their report.
Thanks. And then just one other question then, I guess, is I guess, Mike, this is kind of more maybe philosophical or strategic. I know that Simpson Gresson is kind of leading the pack in terms of consideration of climate change impacts and where things are happening, where things are moving with legislation and climate related financial risk disclosure and all of that. I get the the fairly regular updates, which are just great. So, this FDS that we have in front of us, it doesn't meet our nationally legislated requirements for emissions reduction. And it's, the officers state that in the FDS, we need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. And this strategy does not meet that. So where we're in a situation where, the most critical thing that we're having to consider at this time is climate change and the impacts of climate change. And we've all seen, in recent weeks that much of the world, Europe, areas in China.
Councillor Sampson, I'm going to ask you to be succinct with your questions.
Sure.
Mike has to leave
Yep.
to go back to court in a matter of minutes, and I'd like the other elected members to get a chance to ask their questions.
Great.
To conclude.
So, as an elected member who sat in on all of these hearings and everything, the deliberations across all of it, who has significant concerns from a climate change perspective that this FDS does not meet our nationally legislated requirements, what do I prioritise?
Again, supporting reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is one of those aspects that contributes to a well-functioning urban environment. Achieving the greenhouse gas emissions which our national legislative framework might now require is a challenge that's not unique to this district. It's a region. It's a challenge that's being experienced across the country. And that is why this NPS framework sets up a review process of every 3 years. And it requires an ongoing review and assessment of what measures and what methods can be adopted to try and deliver those particular outcomes. I don't think there's any one silver bullet answer that can be provided now, and that's the challenge that you have to work through. But the office have been well aware of that, and they'll be best placed to speak to that particular concern through the deliberations that happen today.
Thank you. I'll move on to Councillor Greening.
Thank you, Chair. Mike, I have 2 questions. First, a little bit following on from the previous one, I'm recognising the complexity of the document, and I'm sure that's confronting a number of councillors in the room. I'm conscious that, and you've indicated earlier, limitations of change and scope and the ability or the inability to go outside of what was proposed, and I assume that you can reduce and carve off elements if you're not satisfied with what's been recommended. But I suppose my question goes to the heart of this. If we are not satisfied with the recommendations, perhaps they don't adequately reflect the community aspiration, or if we're just not satisfied with the FDS as a whole, I'm just wondering whether it's better, given you've raised some issues about being challenged and again reflecting the complexity of the document, and obviously considerations will have to be borne in mind. If we aren't satisfied with those recommendations of FDS, is it better to not support the FDS at this stage, take it off the table, and fine tune and reconsider in a more informed way the FDS as a whole?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I'm in a position to really provide you with an answer on that front. All I can observe here, I mean, I'm a legal advisor. I'm not able to put myself in your position as decision maker, but I can provide some comments, I suppose, on the process that have led to this point. I mean, we've got an FDS here that was originally conceived by the councils. It was notified for submissions. It's then worked its way through a fairly extensive process and obtained the views of the community. Now, you as a decision may well find that you're not in a position of comfort to make a decision that endorses that. But if you've got those concerns today, your opportunity is to speak to the officers and understand their impressions of the situation and why the recommendations of the subcommittee are what they are.
But if we, as decision,
the process risk is one that I've already touched on. If you reject outright all of the recommendations, then it puts these 2 councils in a position where they don't have a future development strategy. They're non-compliant with the NPSUD in terms of the timeframes that are anticipated, and they're not able to rely on that document that exists to then inform the development of the next LTPs and all of the other strategies that work in tandem with that.
So in terms of if we don't agree with this FDS or elements of it, and I'm conscious of carve-outs, etc., and considerations, which could be here for days, you're saying that basically council does have to rubber stamp this because it doesn't have sufficient time to park it, reconsider elements and bring it back by 2024.
those options have been set out on pages 32 and 33 of the report, and I suspect be better to let the officers speak to that particular process issue that flows out of any decision to reject.
So
Thank you.
Okay, and my second question is around staging guidance and phasing, which was indicated in some reports to be presented to us as part of the final decision. I haven't seen that document. What's the legal standing when that document arises? And maybe staff could indicate whether that document has been circulated. I just haven't received a copy of it yet, but I understood it was going to be presented before finalising the FDS.
Are you talking about the principles to guide the staging and rollout of development?
Yeah, I understand there was a guidance document that would be circulated so we could see it. My question also is, in relation to its legal standing, can developers just walk around it? What's its legal standing in terms of guidance?
That's a question you would be best to direct to the officers. I'm sorry, Councillor Green. I'm not close to that issue.
All right, I'm sure the officers are making notes about the matters that have been raised, and they'll address those as they go through presenting their report. Mike, I can't see any questions in the chamber. There's no questions coming from the chamber, and there's no further questions being signalled on Zoom. So we'll let you get away, and hopefully you get back to court in time for it to go back into session or whatever you've got to do next. So thank you very much for your time today, and appreciate your attendance at our meeting.
Thank you.
That's fine.
Harara.
Now, kia ora committee, I will just note that we do have Kerry Anderson from DLA Piper on the call today. Tēnā koe, Kerry, I think you're there somewhere. I can find your name on the screen too. I'll just welcome you into the meeting. It's a big screen to move around on today, but Kerry is with us. Kerry is, if there are any further legal questions today, Kerry is available to answer those questions. She's been instructed by both Nelson City Council and Tasman District Council. Well, there's a request at the start of the meeting that we just acknowledged who is here in the chamber for those of you who are on Zoom. So I'll perhaps start with Mayor King, and we'll just do a quick going around the table, and then we'll cross to the staff at the end of the room.
I'm King.
Christine McKenzie.
Celia Butler.
Barry Dowler. Kip Mailing. Stuart Bryant.
Mayor Rachel Rees.
Elaine Stevens. Robin Shearer. Hi, Rosie.
Dean McNamara.
David Ogilvie. Dwayne Fletcher. Barry Johnson. And I'll just, on behalf of Jenny, also mention that she's in the room along with Lee. Thanks. Momentary lapse here.
Thank you, Dwayne. All right, so that covers off who is here in the room, and we've now completed the introduction from Mike, and I'm going to now hand over to the officers to present the report. And the first question that I have for the officers are there any corrections or additions that you need to make to the report? If there are, I'll just ask that you either identify those at the start of your presentation or as you move through your presentation. So kia ora, Jackie, kia ora, Chris. I'll leave it to the two of you to start the presentation.
Thanks, Mayor Rees. Just the first correction, I suppose, is that Jackie's name was missed off the top of the report as an author. It was very definitely a joint report, and so she's actually going to speak to you and give that initial introduction to the report. So I'll hand over to Jackie now.
Chris, nice to you can hear me okay, everybody?
You're a little bit hard to hear, Jackie, so we'll just see if we can get that sound up a little bit.
Okay. Is that any better?
Not really.
No. I might just take off the headphones and just speak to the computer and see if that's better. Just hold on.
No, that's not going to work for us. Right, Jackie. If you speak up really loud, I think you'll be fine.
Unplug the headphones.
I have unplugged them and I've put them back in now. Is that any better?
I think we can work with that.
Yeah.
So just keep your voice nice and loud.
Okay, I will do. So first of all, we've got a couple of corrections to the report. Robin, could you put those on the screen, please?
All right, have they been on, are they shared on Zoom as well? We'll just make sure we've got those now. All right, here they are.
Okay, great. So the first one is resolution number 1. It should say that we're receiving the report, future development strategy, acceptance of policy decisions, not adoption of policy decisions. And then the other correction is related to resolutions 3 and 4. And in those resolutions, we've talked about a final FDS, and it should really say for completeness, a draft FDS.
Right, Jackie, I'm just going to interrupt and clarify. We have those as clauses 4 and 5, not 3 and 4.
The original resolution.
We're working off the original that was distributed in the report and the agenda.
Just 1 second, I'll just double check. So yours are 4 and 5, you said, did you?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's what it should be, sorry. It's 4 and 5.
Thank you.
4 and 5, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so those are the corrections. Now I'm just going to spend a few minutes just highlighting a few key points, if we're still okay to do that.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you have a lot of material in front of you today, and this is in part due to the large number of submissions that we've had on the FDS. We had 568 submissions. It does indicate that the communities have engaged well in the process, and it also indicates the complexity of the issues that the FDS has to deal with. The locations of submitters was evenly split. We had 47% of submitters from Nelson, 45% from Tasman, and 8% outside the region. We had 300 participants during the 17 webinars that we held on the FDS consultation period. And each council had over 2,000 hits on their FDS web pages during the consultation. We had 120 submitters who presented to their submissions to the subcommittee over 4 days, and each submitter was given 10 minutes to present. And then through those submissions, there was a further 36 new or amended sites that were proposed for assessment, and 32 of those sites were located in Tasman. The officers are asking today for the Joint Committee to accept the policy recommendations of the FDS subcommittee, and these are highlighted by resolutions numbers 1 to 4. The recommendations of the subcommittee themselves are provided in attachment 1 to the report, and the draft FDS would be returning to the Joint Committee for final adoption at the end of August. I'm just going to highlight now a few of the more complex topics that the FDS has had to deal with and the recommendations of the subcommittee. So concurrent with the submissions hearings, expert conferencing took place between our consultants, who are Barkers, who are joining us today, and Sense Partners, and Kayanga Ora's consultants, Property Economics, regarding their submission. Nelson Tasman 2050's consultant declined to take part in those discussions. The conferencing was mainly concerned with the uptake rate from intensification, the feasibility of intensification, capacity, and the greenfield-brownfield split. After 2 such meetings, Kayanga Ora clarified their position and confirmed general agreement that the 15% uptake rate for intensification was at the lower end of potential development, but it didn't suggest an alternative. As a project team, we consider it appropriate to be conservative in estimating capacity, to reflect the uncertainty and to ensure that we can provide for a high growth scenario. But we also note that both councils can and should aim for more intensification, and that's brownfield as well as maximising densities in greenfield. We have based our uptake rate of 15% on national evidence and evidence to date in Nelson and Tasman. The project team has used a multi-criteria analysis to assess over 209 sites proposed for the FDS. The criteria analysis consisted of 21 different criteria, which we have workshopped with you and refined through consultation. The criteria analysis proved to be a sound framework for assessment of such a large number of varying sites. The FDS has to comply with a number of national policy statements and legislation, and sometimes these are conflicting in their objectives. This is most recently evidenced in the government's recent emissions reduction plan. And action 7.4 in that plan says, and I quote, to assess the extent to which existing urban developments and infrastructure policy programs, for example, the national policy statements on urban development, are aligned with emissions reductions goals. The latest greenfield-brownfield split in the FDS is approximately 46% intensification and 54% greenfield. However, when you break this greenfield proportion down to land that's already zoned for residential and land that isn't, so rural land, the percentages change to 33% of new housing capacity on rural land and 67% would be intensification, infill and zoned greenfield land development. Now it's important to say that the project team did not start with any percentage split in mind. We tried to maximise intensification, but couldn't realistically find enough to meet a high growth scenario. So we then added in well-performing greenfield sites to provide sufficient capacity for 30 years. In an effort to address the concerns of many submitters over greenhouse gas emissions, council staff undertook their own household emissions analysis in the absence of direction from central government. Officers have had to develop this from first principles rather than using a tested methodology. This analysis was in addition to the multi-criteria analysis already weighting public and active transport mode access for sites by a factor of 5. This is a higher weighting than other criteria analysis exercises have used by other councils, for example, Wellington and Rotorua Lakes. What we found from our own greenhouse gas modelling is that no scenario, even an intensification only scenario, using an unrealistic uptake rate of 30%, reaches the 100% reduction in current emissions needed by 2050. The recommended spatial scenario by the subcommittee, which is the scenario of growth largely consolidated along State Highway 6, reduces emissions by 94%. It's also worth noting that greenfield sites close to Nelson, Stoke and Richmond perform as well as brownfield intensification sites for greenhouse gas emissions. This FDS is one snapshot in time. It will be reviewed in 3 years' time. The FDS provides for a high growth scenario in both councils to ensure that we have sufficient capacity for 30 years. However, we may not see high growth in both councils or either council in the future. Our updated population projections every 3 years will guide us for this. Officers therefore recommend that the annual implementation plan for the FDS considers population growth trends, housing demand, and uptake of intensification, and that the councils control the release of land through rezoning and servicing to see if we can further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Each plan change that the councils undertake will need to consider how it can minimise greenhouse gas emissions further, as Waka Kotahi has suggested. The proportion of actual development that occurs on greenfield and brownfield sites will depend on how the two councils roll out plan changes to implement the FDS. Servicing plays a part too, encouraging sequencing of developments, including on land already zoned. Plan changes take time, for example, 2 years from notification to becoming operative. So it's important that barriers to intensification are removed ASAP to allow this type of development to occur. And finally, a large number of new sites were assessed following submissions, and I thought it was worthwhile just highlighting some of those key changes from the draft FDS as recommended by the subcommittee. And these are as follows. Removal of the Tahunanui core slump infill area. Clarification that the Wood and Tahunanui FDS areas remain in the FDS, but subject to the outcomes of the Climate Dynamic Adaptive Pathway Plan process, but also that they don't form part of our capacity at this stage. Removing area N102 and part of N34 inside the 55 dBA airport noise contour in Nelson. Expanding both areas N11 Saxton and N112 Orphanage West by adding 2 additional areas. Removal of the secondary part of the proposal, which is for a new community near Tasman Village and Lower Moturi. Adding site T198 Falcon Ridge Winery in Brightwater and removing site T54 Teapot Valley in Brightwater. As a result of some new sites being added in Nelson, removing 3 sites in Wakefield, T41 in 88 Valley Road, and T28 and T32 in Pigeon Valley. However, signalling in the FDS that these sites could be considered in the very long term if capacity is needed. Removal of site T143 in Keegan Road, Tarpaka, due to concerns over the site's wetlands and part of the site being in the mapped coastal environment. Removal of part of site T01, Jeffreys Road, Brightwater, but also adding another small area for that site. Removing site T03, Shiny Hills, Brightwater, and removing site T48, Roadtie Road in Tarpaka, all due to landowner opposition. Adding sites T205 and T213 in Motueka Valley, extending existing site T17 in the draft FDS. Adding site T206, Hickmott Place, Motueka for mixed-use development. Adding site T217 in Tapawera. And adding site T219 near St. Arnaud to adjoin existing site T181 in the draft FDS, noting that the full extent of these sites should not be developed due to wetlands. There's also a number of small site boundary adjustments to align with Tasman District Council's growth plan change, which is occurring at the same time. In reaching these decisions on changes to sites, the subcommittee considered a number of factors, including responses to limited further consultation undertaken by officers with landowners and adjoining landowners. This consultation was undertaken following submissions and before deliberations. Thank you for listening. I hope you've been able to hear me, and the officers recommend that the Joint Committee accepts the policy recommendations of the subcommittee for the FDS. We would next update the FDS documentation and bring that back to you for the 29th of August Joint Committee for adoption.
Thank you, Jackie. We can hear you fine, and you're satisfied that you've covered the matters that were asked of Mike, and you've given your responses in your presentation now.
I believe so, but if there's anything outstanding, then happy to take further questions.
All right, thank you. I'll just come back to Chris. Chris, is there anything further that you wish to add?
No, just ready to take questions.
All right, thank you very much. So I'll just note, just go back to the small changes that have been made. So from the agenda that was distributed, we've covered off the small changes. I think they're quite clear. I haven't seen any signals in the room that anyone's needs any further clarification. Hopefully those of you on Zoom followed those as well. They're very minor. All right, I'll open now for questions. I'll go to Councillor McGurk.
Yeah, thanks, Madam. Through you. Look, I'm happy to move the recommendations as they've been put up, including the amendments in its entirety. At least we've got something to discuss.
I'm happy to second, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. They've been moved with those minor amendments by Councillor McGurk and seconded by Deputy Mayor Bryant. Thank you, Councillor McGurk. Did you have any comments at this stage?
I have no questions at this stage, and I'll reserve my right to speak.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Councillor McGurk. I'll next go on to Councillor Greening, and then I'll come to Councillor McKenzie, and then I'll move from there.
Thank you, Chair. Just following up on my question to Mike, really, which was the staging guidance. I understood that was going to be presented in advance of the final decision, or now it's been called the draft decision. Has that been circulated, and what is the status of that guidance in terms of its binding nature on potential developers? Can they walk around it? I also have a question, that's my first question, which is just a follow-up because I didn't think it was clarified in the presentation. My second question relates to the addition of sites. So we had an earlier discussion about scope. I'm just wondering whether the public had the opportunity to provide feedback on those additions other than the direct owners. Otherwise, I thought we were stepping outside of the scope, which Mike was indicating we could not do. And thirdly, I'd like to propose an amendment just to get the ball rolling, but I'll probably add some more later, conscious of time and everyone else having the opportunity to participate, which is I would like to have an addition which says, for the purposes of clarity, this FDS removes all rural one land.
Thank you, Councillor Greening. I will note that you're foreshadowing an amendment at this point. We'll leave it in that space. Are you happy for that? Because you'll need to
Well, it's not a foreshadowed amendment, it is an amendment.
It's an amendment, all right.
I'm waiting to see if someone wants to pick it up as a seconder. And
All right.
finally, I will be calling a division on the voting of this FDS. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Greening. All right, let's start with your questions. So I'll go to the officers to respond to the questions.
Thank you, Mary. So apologies, I forgot about the memo on implementation. That's attachment 7 to today's report. Sorry, someone else is talking. Now I have Rachel Morgan on the line who can talk to that from Barker's. The idea is that the memo informs the eventual FDS in terms of principles for staging, but I'll let Rachel have a few words on that.
Good afternoon. In attachment 7, it's on page 102 of the agenda report. We've set out recommendations for staging principles. We've developed those as a draft, and they are really based on the FDS outcomes or the FDS objectives, and they cover a range of issues, including prioritising growth within existing urban areas and supporting the uptake of intensification opportunities to promote a consolidated urban form. There's also criteria on promoting the efficient use and provision of infrastructure, delivering on iwi and hapu aspirations, taking into account the willingness of landowners to develop, as well as delivering and supporting the delivery of sufficient development capacity and acknowledging other constraints as well. So as Jackie mentioned, these principles would form part of the implementation section of the FDS, and they would be a tool to inform the more detailed staging and planning, which would be implemented through the annual joint implementation plan, which is a companion document to the FDS. And in terms of its legal standing, because these principles would be included within the draft FDS, they would be in future planning decisions, decision makers would need to have regard to them in making those planning decisions.
Thank you. Now back to Jackie, just to cover off any other matters raised by Councillor Greening. And then I'll just check that Councillor Greening to see if he has any follow-up questions.
Thank you, Mary. So the question concerning the changes to the draft FDS that the subcommittee has recommended in terms of new sites or amended sites, this is dealt with in sections probably 26.5 to 26 point 12 of the 31st of May deliberations officers report. But just very briefly, it's not that we can't make any changes, it's that the changes that we make have to be within scope of the draft FDS. We set out in that report there that the officers undertook further limited consultation, as I mentioned in my introduction, to gauge reaction to adjoining landowners of any new sites. The subcommittee also took into account the submissions generally that were received and the views of the public on greenfield versus intensification and areas as well. Those sort of changes should be capable of being anticipated because we asked questions in our questionnaire about, do you think these are the best sites for each town, or are there better alternatives? And the reason for some sites being excluded have been consistent. Either the landowner opposed them or they were poorly scoring sites in comparison to other sites put forward in submissions. So I think the integrity of the model remains. It's only about a 3.6% change in the total development area from the draft FDS, so it's not considered to be highly significant.
Thank you. Any supplementary questions from you, Councillor Greening? No? All right, in that case, I will move on to Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you very much. Through you, Madam Mayor. I have got 3 questions. I think they'll be reasonably quick. So I listened carefully to Mike Wakefield when he talked about the FDS being a high-level policy document which needs to be given a degree of weight when making decisions. I listened to his wording around having regard to. So my question specifically is this: is there anything that we would be locking into the FDS which actually remains locked in concrete simply through the process of it being in the FDS? So that's my first question.
Thank you. I'll ask the officers to respond.
Through the chair, yes, it is a policy document, so it's not directive and it's not black and white. So there's nothing that locks you in completely. It has to be considered, but that's all.
Thank you. My second question is, apart from information which is legally privileged, is there any information that the subcommittee have worked through which has not been made publicly available?
I'll go to Jackie.
Thanks, Mary. So no, any additional information that was requested from officers was placed on the website during the hearings. There are a number of attachments to the 31st of May deliberations report that fall into that category.
Thank you. And if I may, my third question is, I feel as I should know the answer to this one. Will all submitters get a response to their submission, which is, personalised to them and deals with the points they've raised?
Thank you, Jackie.
Thanks, Mary. Yes, they will. We're currently just working through that process at the moment. They will probably vary in terms of the length of responses. Some submitters will have a generic response, but others that have, for example, suggested sites or have been landowners affected will get a more detailed response.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll go to Councillor O'Neill Stevens next.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I'll just start with 2 or 3 questions, but might come back with some more. So looking at the report in front of us today, page 21, theme 2, just that third recommendation down recommends clarifying in the FDS that greenfield development will enable intensification. I'm just curious where the evidence base for that comes from, particularly noting the comments made by Dr. Lees in 12.18 of the subcommittee report, where he's in response to the interpretation of his report that releasing greenfield lands would increase intensification across the shared urban area. he says very clearly it will not. So where is the evidence base for greenfield development enabling intensification?
Thank you. I'll go to the officers or to the consultants, whoever wishes to answer that one. Thank you, Jackie.
Thanks, Maryse. I did lose the reference that Councillor O'Neill-Stevens gave me, but I think the point that's being made there is about trying to maximise the densities on greenfield land of housing. So Cam Barker from Barker's may want to add here, but we certainly have a range of typologies proposed for greenfield sites as well, including, we're trying to maximise densities throughout, and I think that's what's been referred to there actually.
Thank you. Does the consultant wish to add anything further?
Thank you, Maryse. It's obviously in Dr. Lee's kind of wheelhouse. My understanding was that specific query that Councillor O'Neill-Stevens raised was in reference to enabling some greenfield land would help suppress overall land prices across the region, and the lower land prices will aid in the kind of feasibility of intensification. That's my understanding of Dr. Lee's position.
Can I just add something in there?
Yes, of course, Chris. Thank you.
So yeah, so I think coming back to what Jackie has said, that's absolutely correct. That we're actually, and I think possibly the use of the term intensification is maybe confusing things a little bit in respect to how it's used in point 2 there under 4.21. It is about taking those opportunities to increase the density of the greenfield development that we will see going forward, which we are already seeing, but making sure that the regulatory environment that we end up with does enable that.
Thank you. Any further questions, Councillor O'Neill-Stevens?
Yes, and may I just suggest then that perhaps some wording work is required in that recommendation, because currently it appears to directly contradict the report to the subcommittee. Then just moving through to just further through those recommendations by the subcommittee, theme 5, and the noting or the inclusion in the FDS that there are conflicting demands between the climate change direction and housing capacity direction provided by central government. Again, basically the same question is, you know, what are those conflicting demands and where is the evidence for them?
I think through the chair, I think it's pretty well recognised that additional development does, in the current environment with our current technology, does increase greenhouse gas emissions. There's no denying that, whether that's intensification or greenfield. You put more people in an area, there's going to be more travel, there's going to be the demand for further building materials, all of that. So that is in itself in direct conflict with growth in any form, is really in direct conflict with the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions if you take out the emergence of any new technologies and the uptake of, for example, electric vehicles. So it's really acknowledging that, you know, and it's not just those two that conflict. There's a whole lot of them. There's the guidance around productive land, that's in conflict as well. You know, we need more houses, but that in itself can end up consuming more land, if you like.
Okay, thanks. And then just finally for now, what affordability lens has been cast over the FDS and the policy decisions being made today? And specifically, have we looked at location affordability, particularly in regards to the total affordability of an area, taking into account transport costs?
So through Maryse, I guess one of the main aims of the FDS to help affordability, because there are so many factors that affect affordability that are out of our control as councils. But one of the aims is to ensure that we have competitive land markets, and that's something that's required by the National Policy Statements on Urban Development. And that's why, and another reason why we have a balance of different types of sites in different areas to try and prevent developers, cornering the market in any one area, and to keep those land markets competitive. Together with actually ensuring that we provide sufficient capacity, even under a high growth scenario for 30 years, those are some of the key things that we can do as councils to help affordability.
And can I just add, on the transport front, the looking at those costs, one of the key criteria, or it actually made up more than one of the criteria, was our accessibility analysis, which looked at exactly that, not cost directly, but distance travelled, and that essentially forms a proxy for that.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jackie.
All right, thank you, Councillor Neil-Stevens. I'll now go to Councillor Mayling, and then I'll come back to Councillor Laurie.
Right. I'll be brief. So first of all, I support the motion, but I just want to ask Chris a question about the status of the plan change in Nelson City in relation to intensification. My understanding is that was to start after the 2019 FDS, and I believe it is yet to progress. So can you tell us the status and when it will progress?
I might need a bit of a hand on that one. But Claire, are you able to provide any further advice on that one?
Can I come back to you in a couple of minutes on that question?
That'll be fine. Any further questions, Councillor Mayling?
It just raises a concern if that plan doesn't get progressed, we won't meet our intensification obligations. And that's the concern I've had. And I've discussed it with you previously, Mary.
It's a shared concern, Councillor Mayling. I'll move to Councillor Laurie, and then I'll come to Councillor McNamara.
Kia ora, Rachel. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate all the work that's gone into this. My question relates to the large urban spaces that we have in Nelson Central City that we use almost exclusively for storage of cars, parking squares. I'm talking about the big spaces we've got in the middle of town at Buxton Square, Montgomery Square, Whakatu Square, Miller's Acre. Nelson City's also got a great property that's just used for the parking of council vehicles in New Street. I'm wondering if this future development strategy considered the airspace above these parking spaces for housing, because this is an option that is being explored overseas and in fact done overseas. You might have seen a concept that I've put out there with the help of architect Pierre Hammond and landscape architect Ursula Baumann. There's been a lot of interest in that idea. And given that this is a future development strategy, I'm wondering whether the opportunity for housing, for a considerable amount of housing in a really great spot, in these really great spots, has that been considered?
So through Mayor East, I might just go first on that one, and Chris can obviously speak as well. Yes, it has. So site T206 in Hickmott Place in Motueka is exactly that. It's apartments proposed over a car park, which was proposed by a submitter. It's worth saying that actually Tasman's resource management plan already enables that kind of development. So our commercial zone already enables residential above a commercial ground floor as well. It's just something that doesn't seem to have occurred very much. But the Hickmott Place is a council-owned car park where we have where we're proposing basically either apartments over the car park or apartments over a commercial ground floor.
Okay, well that's great for, sorry, Madam that's great for Motueka.
I think Chris is about, Councillor Laurie, Chris is
gotcha.
ready to answer. So we'll just work through the chair. Thank you, Chris.
Sorry. So through the chair, in the Nelson context, the FDS certainly doesn't preclude that from happening. In fact, it's not really, it's constraints outside the FDS process, well outside the scope of the FDS process, that are likely to be what drives or limits the timing or the the ability of that project to occur. The FDS anticipates intensification happening over the whole city centre in Nelson. So that would certainly be consistent with the FDS in that respect. But of course, there's other aspects of those, and I'm sort of possibly stepping a little bit back to my previous life at Nelson City Council in the transport space, where how those land parcels that make up those parking squares were acquired is quite a large issue that needs to be considered when if they're ever to be developed, and because there are some limitations that around how they can be used that would need to be worked through. Yeah, so it's not the FDS that would be limiting anything happening in those locations.
I'll just go to Cam. I think so. You've got your hand up. Did you have something to add to that conversation, Cam?
Yeah, it's directly responding to Councillor Lowry. The short answer is yes. The capacity assumptions have essentially assumed some level of development would occur on a lot of those car parking sites. So in a very kind of roundabout way, it assumes that they would be put to potentially more productive uses than just surface level car parking to achieve the levels of intensification required to meet the housing targets.
Thank you.
So through the chair, does that mean those actual potential dwellings have been included in the same way that we've included potential dwellings on greenfield land?
Yes, essentially that those assumptions around redevelopment of those sites have fed into the capacity numbers for those specific FDS areas within Nelson City Centre.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll move on to, I'll just go to Ms. Barton because she might have the answer to Councillor Mayling's question, and then I'll come to Councillor McNamara.
Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. So in terms of the housing plan change, officers are working on some additional information that the elected members have requested. It will be workshopped in August, and we're endeavouring to bring something forward in September in terms of the council.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor McNamara.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just a question so I understand what I'm approving here. For example, in 10E, you're recommending to both councils that they give consideration to how to support the future development strategy intensification goals through land aggregation, including working with Kāinga Ora. If I approve this, what exactly does that mean?
Through the Mayor, that refers to investigating what role the two councils can play in terms of land assembly. And we had a workshop earlier in the day where I covered that, but for the benefit of the Nelson City Councillors, I'll just summarise that. It's essentially the idea that council tries to increase the size of developable footprints in certain parts of the urban area, probably in Nelson and Richmond primarily, by acquiring smaller lots and consolidating them and then selling them to developers to provide higher density, larger type developments. The alternative is that many of these sites might end up with 2 or 3 small standalone lots at the back with 1 metre paling, 1 metre to 1 metre paling fence. And we lose the opportunity to make real use of those sites longer term. This is simply to go and investigate the feasibility, the commercial sustainability, and what models might be available to the councils to explore should it wish to.
So by approving it through the chair, I am giving you permission to go away and research it.
Through the Mayor, this the recommendation is to recommend to each council that they do this. How that's given effect will need to be considered by each council. At the moment, both councils are considering whether to use better off funding to investigate the feasibility, sustainability part that I referred to, but that ultimately will be whether that in fact is funded that through the mechanism for us, but at least we decide on the 22nd of September.
The subcommittee doesn't have an ability, just for all the elected members, the subcommittee doesn't have the ability to go beyond recommending through to councils on some of these matters. So that is what has been captured as we come through, because they rely on the delegation for those decisions sits with the council. So their recommendations through, and that would be what they would have to be here, because that's where the delegation sits. So what Dwayne is saying is essentially those matters are the subject of future council decisions. Anything further?
I just wonder how that sits in the FDS. Like, this is a, an overarching plan of things moving ahead.
Through the Mayor, one of the challenges that was kind of acknowledged and recognised through the community feedback and through the expert advice given to the subcommittee is that is the take-up rate of intensification, for example, and the degree to which you can get a certain degree of intensification on certain sites. And it is one of those features that constrains that potential is the small size of the land holdings that we have in the different urban areas. So it was a direct recognition of the fact that there might be an avenue available to the councils to address that aspect of it and potentially lift the intensification potential.
So on a different issue, I have a bit of a problem with the Wakefield sites being removed because we've added extra sites in Nelson, given some of the discussion already around affordability and are we meeting a range of things on offer. I would suggest that the people moving out to Wakefield are not the ones looking to build in a Nelson or outskirts of Nelson. So I'm just wondering why we had to remove Wakefield rather than just include more or less, given that Tasman is the one with the high growth projection.
Right, I'll come to the officers.
So, yeah, through Mayor Rees. Couple of points there, I suppose. In particular, there are two sites proposed in Nelson through submissions, the Saxton extension and the Orphanage West extension, which obviously came through quite late in the day through submissions, but they score much more highly than the Wakefield sites. The Pigeon Valley standard residential greenfield site, T28, was actually our worst performing greenfield site out of all the sites that we assessed. So continuing the methodology of the multi-criteria assessment, if a better site is proposed through submissions, then logically you would remove the more poorly performing sites, which is essentially what happened. The other factor, I suppose, is that from memory, the subcommittee also took into account the strength of views through submissions on rural residential developments in Tasman. So the Pigeon Valley had a rural residential component, and the opposition to greenfield expansion generally due to greenhouse gas emissions, and sites such as those at Wakefield perform worse in terms of greenhouse gas emissions than sites closer to the Nelson Stoke urban areas, such as the ones that I've just mentioned.
Thank you. Based on that explanation, I'm happy to support Councillor Greening's amendment.
All right, thank you. I'll just need to ask for some commentary from the officers. I think from memory, just taking the advice from our legal team, we just need to, any changes, we need to just consider those in the context of the matters and submissions that we've considered.
So can I just consider raising a point of order? Obviously for you to rule on, you'll have to consider whether an amendment to remove all rural one land is a direct conflict with the substantive resolution.
I'll need to.
You'll need advice from the.
I'll need to
whether
that's
it substantially.
We'll need to take some advice from the officers.
Effectively eliminates the entire.
Yes, so I won't treat that as a point of order at this point, Mayor King. What I'll do is get the advice first, and then we'll see how we go from there.
I'll have a stab if that's all right.
Thank you, Dwayne.
As I understand it, some of the rural one land that's currently zoned includes the Richmond South land that's included in the FDS, and probably a substantial portion of your future capacity that you need to rely on to meet your FDS requirements is in that land. So if you strike out rural one land, you strike out that land. And that, coming back to Mike's points around, do you meet the objectives in the FDS as contemplated in the National Policy Statement, and do you undermine the integrity of the FDS as a whole? I would say yes to both of those things. You will not be acting in a way that preserves the intent or of the FDS or the integrity of the FDS. I'm happy to, if any other staff want to add to that.
Thank you, Dwayne. I do see that Cam has got his hand up. Cam, did you wish to speak to that matter?
Yeah, just for more information purposes for councillors. So I've just quickly looked at that. There's around 3,500 homes within the sites we're recommending currently on the rural one land. So you'd effectively be losing 3,500 potential sites. The majority of that is in kind of Richmond South, but some big portions in Brightwater, and then around 200 homes in Wakefield as well would be affected.
And I'll now go to Jackie, because we need to take some advice on this, as we've been given our briefing this morning about how we approach this matter. Jackie.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Yeah, I think one of the issues that could raise would be, as Dwayne alluded to, the integrity of the multi-criteria analysis. So the sites that have been included, recommended for inclusion rather, have been done so because they have performed well and scored well overall. I think Mirka may be on the line, and she may wish to talk about the predictive values of rural one land, but you know, they do vary across the site. So because a site is zone rural one may not mean that it actually scores badly in terms of the multi-criteria analysis.
All right, we'll see if Mirka is there, because we did spend some time on this matter in detail in the hearings and deliberation process. Mirka,
Yeah.
Yes, Mirka, wait, thank you, we can hear you.
I'm actually not sure if I can answer that question. When I look at how a parcel of land scores in terms of productivity, I just look at the land use classification and the productive land classification. I don't look at whether it's zoned rural 1, 2, or 3. I didn't look at that layer at all. So I'm not sure. I'd have to look at both layers at the same time and see how they overlap.
Thank you. So when you're doing your analysis, you're looking at the productivity is the critical factor that you're looking at.
Yes, yeah. I disregarded what it was zoned as, whether it's rural 1 or 2. I just look at the productivity assessment.
All right, thank you. I'll go to Chris. He's also got his hand up.
So, you know, while the rural 1 has been referred to, because that's the zoning in Tasman, the equivalent in Nelson would be rural zoning, and some of our highest performing sites, for example in the Saxton area, would be excluded by that as well, which from a integrity of the multi-criteria analysis would certainly not make sense.
So I think I want the officers really, I suppose what Dwayne is saying to us, that would undermine the integrity of the analysis. Is that essentially where you've got to, Dwayne?
Yeah, the simple and plain merits of the analysis suggest you include them. And I'm referring back to Mike's points. He had 5, but 2 of them were, do you meet your MPS objectives? The answer would be no. The second would be, would you undermine the integrity of the FDS as a whole? Or because of the first point, the answer is yes, you would undermine the integrity of the FDS. So those are things he asked you to consider carefully.
Just a point of order, Mr. Mayor. Isn't it, Madam Mayor?
Yes, Councillor Greening.
Chris reinterpreted my motion. It was rural 1 land, which would be directed towards Tasman, not Nelson.
I don't think I'll uphold that as a point of order against the officer. What we'll do is that you're kindly providing a clarification that you want this restricted to Tasman only. I'm not a big fan of point of orders, by the way. They're a last resort when things are so. All right, so I think we've had some advice from the officers to the joint committee that removing, so I just need to go back to the officers, if it's restricted to, and to Cam, to our consultants, removing rural, in your view, what would be the consequence? Is your advice still the same, that it would undermine the integrity of the FDS? I think Cam's already answered that one, but Jackie, we'll come to you.
Yep, through the Mayor. Yes, I think it would do, because as I say, the multi-criteria analysis has been undertaken in a logical way. And so to pick out those sites randomly would undermine its integrity. The other issue is that by removing all rural 1 land, I think Cam just said it was amounted to about 3,000 dwellings. that would then mean that we haven't got sufficient capacity for the 30 years for a high growth scenario.
In that case, I don't think we can take that amendment on the basis that it would be inconsistent with the elements that have all been moved and seconded. So they come as a suite, and I don't think that that would be a viable amendment in the context of the recommendation in the report that has now been moved and seconded. I just want to take some advice, leave the officers to consider that, and I want them to come back with something just to take a few moments, Councillor Greening, because it's not very often that I'd rule out an amendment. If there's anything further you want to say before I take a brief adjournment, I'll take that now.
Yeah, which is basically it's consistent with the community view, which is what we're supposed to strongly take into account and give adequate weight to. In Tasman, our community are very strong advocates. It comes up in all our surveys and through other submissions as well, that they do not want the loss of rural one land. It's even inherent in the argument for the Waimea Dam, which it was constructed and invested on the basis of enabling productive land to be used. If this rural one land is to be consumed, then that undermines the whole thesis of the dam, because as more rural one land is consumed, water consumption drops and the whole purpose of the dam becomes irrelevant.
Right, thank you, Councillor Greening. I'll just go to Councillor McNamara before we take a brief adjournment.
So just another point for clarification, would it make any difference if it was just rural one land within the Waimea irrigatable zone?
We'll have to go to the officers to consider that.
Through the Mayor, we'd have to take a moment to check, but if that includes the Richmond South area, parts around Brightwater, then yes.
I think the answer will be the same. We'll take a very brief adjournment, so go and have a little break of those who are on Zoom. We should only be 5 minutes, so we'll start again at 3:15. And then I think we're getting ready. We're pretty much at the end. Chris, Councillor Hill's next up, and then we'll start to move into debate. Kia ora tātou, thank you very much. This just given the officers a moment to consider Councillor Greening and Councillor McNamara's proposed amendment. So I'll go back to the officers. Who would like to start off just in terms of a response? Dwayne or Jackie?
I'll start, Jackie. And do you mind following up with some of the other points that we discussed a moment ago?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the questions, is it a direct negative? And the answer is it's probably more like an indirect negative. It's inconsistent with the resolution set as a whole. And I hate to sound like a broken record, but I fundamentally one of the points is that even if you take, whether it's the all of Rural 1 or just Rural 1 that relates to land that could be potentially irrigated via water from the Waimea Dam, you will strike out enough capacity in your FDS as a whole that you don't meet your national policy statement objectives, and therefore you know, this part or that particular proposition would undermine your entire FDS as well as not meeting those objectives. I'll probably pass over to Jackie if that's okay, just to talk about some of the land-specific issues. Actually, probably before I do, the only other thing is if you don't want to avoid that situation where you're not meeting your objectives, you have to substitute. You have to have really good reasons for why you're throwing this and putting in a substitution, given all the evidence and all the assessments undertaken by staff and the merits of that assessment. And that will be extraordinarily hard to do because Rural 1 land makes up the majority of Tasman. Jackie?
Thank you, Jackie.
Okay, thanks, Maurice. Yeah, so there's a few points from me. So we already mentioned it would undermine the integrity of the multi-criteria analysis to just swap out sites as has been suggested, because potentially we'd be taking out better performing sites and replacing them with worse performing sites. Basically for this FDS, anything that's for productive land, which I think is the concern here, anything that's scored a 0 or a 1, in other words, anything that was highly productive or had large amounts of productive land was struck out immediately as a no-go constraint. The reason why we have a handful, or less than a handful actually, probably about 3 sites in this FDS, which are highly productive, for example, Richmond South, is because they were adopted as part of the 2019 Future Development Strategy. And the council has already made a decision to move on with the rezoning of that land. So that's why those sites are a little bit different and are in the FDS. And that was all explained in the technical report to the draft FDS, just for clarification.
Thank you. Anything further from the officers? All right, so the focus through the FDS process was on highly productive land. It was looking, that was undertaken in some detail through the multi-criteria analysis, and on the advice of the officers, the amendment would undermine the FDS and we would not meet the NPS objective. So on the basis that it is inconsistent with the objectives, with the intent of the work that we're doing here and the legislation that we need to respond to, I'm going to rule that under the standing orders that I will reject the amendment. And that's provision in the standing orders.
Madam Chair, may I then modify my motion?
Well, how about you pop back in the speaking order for a moment, and I'll actually know while you're there, Councillor Greening, you can try again. But I think the advice has been very clear. And I would just remind the obligation for those of you who are participating in this process that you need to be familiar with the submissions, with the deliberations process and the analysis from the officers as you're starting to look at modifying the recommendations.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I'm operating within, how should I say, a paradigm which may itself be slightly flawed. I understand the paradigm, which is you have high growth, which I don't think we all necessarily, maybe many do, but I understand that certainly a number of the community submitters and maybe even some councillors don't necessarily agree that it should be a high growth model. If it was not a high growth model, but we made an amendment that it was a medium growth aspiration, then I would have assumed that the impact of my amendment would have been less. So I'm just wondering whether there's a timing issue there, but maybe this will come up in a wider debate. The other point is I just wonder whether the amendment, if the concern is a loss of housing within this paradigm of high growth, whether the motion should it be extended to instruct staff to identify and bring back to the joint committee identified brownfields that would compensate for the reduction of greenfields, and therefore it would not be compromised.
Councillor Greening, I don't think you've offered me anything yet that would get to the sort of threshold test for a viable amendment, but I do think what you're articulating is the living nature of the FDS and the reason why it has implementation plans that come from them. We do have an intensification action plans. We have a number of matters and it will get reviewed again. So on the basis of the evidence that's been presented and analysed, the inputs have created the assessment for the multi-criteria analysis, and trying to, I think the advice this morning is you'd have to have very sound reasons now to say that the inputs were incorrect or not evidentially based, and I'm not hearing anything that would substantiate that at this point in time. You can have a think about it some more if you like, and I'll go to, I had Councillor Hill was next up, so I'll go to you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I raised my hand earlier after the amendment was suggested with concern of maybe a lack of understanding of what rural one zone land is. There's an assumption, I think, that it's all highly productive land, which is not. I'm looking at some rural zoned rural one land at the moment out my window, and I tell you, there's a whole lot of it that's not very productive at all. So I've been listening to the advice from staff about that, and Mercus particularly. But if I guess my comment was if the amendment was going to be put, then I'd want to know that, or I'd encourage that advice be given that everybody understood actually what rural one land is, and that there's not a direct correlation to it all being highly productive.
Thank you, Councillor Helen. Yes, I think you have just given a very immediate example of actually why that analysis at Rural 1 doesn't achieve the outcomes that the FDS was looking to do, which was to protect highly productive land, and that was the focus of the work that went into the multi-criteria analysis. So I think the office has covered that. There was quite a lot of work that went into that assessment, and as Jackie has said, if it rated at 1, it was immediately struck out, so it wasn't even considered. So I think we've covered that. I'll now move to Councillor Sanson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, through the chair. So first of all, thanks to all involved in their work on this, the staff or officers, and then the subcommittee. I did sit through the hearings and deliberations, and I am familiar with all of the analysis, so thanks for that. I've got a really high level question which goes like this: what consideration was had for infinite growth on a finite planet? And given that we have we see through this FDS that we're not going to meet our emissions reduction targets, which is 50% by 2030, so that's about 7 years away, and also the carrying capacity of the environment and the productive land, and that by adopting a high growth model for this, we have committed ourselves to finding capacity that seems to be going against the I guess guidance from central government around other targets we need to meet, and also significant community voice. I'm just wondering what kind of considerations were had for, needing to constrain growth.
I'll go to the officers, but I do feel they have canvassed this already, but I'll go briefly to Chris. Thank you.
So through you, Madam Mayor. So this really comes back to that that conflict between the guidance that we have in the various documents, the various national policy statements and legislation. The whole existence of a future development strategy comes from the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which in itself says that we shall meet demand. And it doesn't say that we are able to constrain demand or, you know, and I suppose the question is, how would we even go about doing that? Some of the effects of maybe not meeting that demand would certainly be increased property prices. We end up in a situation very similar to Queenstown, but there's no real wriggle room in the national policy statement to allow us to go and say, you know, we're only going to allow growth up to a certain level, and then, sorry, after that, we're shutting the gates. There's just no allowance for that, and the FDS reflects that.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, we are constrained by the direction of the National Policy Statement. Any further questions?
Yeah, I've got a few. Chris, just thanks for that. I had another a question around in terms of, obviously Nelson has a far smaller land area than Tasman. I'm not quite sure. You know, I don't know if it's a 20th of the size, but when you look on a map, it's considerably smaller. And there have been, through this whole process, a number of comments around Nelson needing to, you know, carry its fair share of growth capacity and that kind of thing. When the analysis was done by staff, is there consideration of the difference in land area of the two regions, and that, you know, if we are 1/20th the size of Tasman, maybe our growth capacity assumptions should be, you know, in proportion, or is that not considered?
So through the chair, no, when we do our growth projections, they're done using the, so for example, using the high growth scenario that we have, that's directly a Stats New Zealand high growth scenario that we've taken straight from the information that they've provided, straight from their website, and that's provided for Nelson. As far as the provision of how we meet that, we haven't gone and separated out Nelson and Tasman. It's very much a joint strategy, and we've looked at combined what we need, and then we've looked at providing that over the combined area. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that if we look at just the urban areas within each of Nelson and Tasman, they're not too dissimilar. If you included those other areas like Motueka that we've included in the urban environment, if you like. So it's not a direct apples for apples comparison, if you like, and that's why, for example, with the introduction of some additional sites in Nelson and the Saxton areas, we were able to, or the subcommittee was able to remove some poorer scoring sites in Tasman. We were very much looking at it as an overall strategy rather than separating out areas.
Okay, thanks. So then maybe what I'm hearing is that even though Nelson is much smaller, we might be shouldering a greater proportion of the growth capacity than Tasman.
I'll go to Jackie, who's got her hand up.
Thanks, Mary. So I just wanted to clarify that as a shared tier 2 urban environment, the FDS is required to provide sufficient capacity for that shared urban environment, and it doesn't advocate separating out Nelson from Tasman. So we have to look at the kind of Nelson, Stoke, Richmond, all the other urban environment areas in Tasman. That's the key focus of the FDS. And then we also have the rural part of the FDS for the rural Tasman towns, but it's very much a combined urban environment area.
Okay, that's great, thanks. So on page 31 at 4.27, it talks about the undeveloped land east of Princess Drive, 12
140 houses capacity on the southern end of the Tahuna Hills. This was omitted from the draft FDS, and when queried, officers said that this was missed but would be rectified in the FDS. So can you confirm if this is being included in the FDS and what density assumptions are being applied to this?
Yes, we can. Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, we can confirm that it is included in the FDS. Sorry, what I've just entirely slipped my mind. What was the second part of your question?
Just what density assumptions, because obviously when we looked at the mapping, the maps that were provided, there was, medium density urban areas. So I'm just curious what density assumptions have been applied to this area.
So if I can refer through to Cam for that one. Are you able to help with that, Cam?
Yeah, it's I think it's fairly lower density, is kind of in line with the existing residential zone in Nelson, because I think a lot of those areas are quite they've got quite a number of topographical constraints, and they are kind of less well located in terms of accessibility to centres and stuff like that. So it's just kind of, I would probably describe it as kind of your more standard subdivision that's kind of occurring around the place already.
Okay, it is kind of, I mean, I'm looking out my window at it now. It's, it's within spitting distance via direct line to the Rutherford Hotel. It's pretty central, I'd say. I'm just, was there not consideration that it should be at the same density level as other parts of the hills around the city, Tahunanui and that kind of thing?
No, there wasn't any consideration around increased densities like other areas.
Okay, I mean, why I'm asking is that it's it's right in the kind of urban fringe of the city centre, and it was missed out, and now we've heard that it hasn't been mapped for greater density like other areas, including which, this Tahunanui slump has now been removed, which is great, but even the Tahunanui slump was flagged for greater density. So I have some concerns about what the implications for the kind of underlying assumptions and analysis of the FDS might be. On the same page 31 at 4.26, so I've kind of got two questions here. My first is, what are the implications? So this is just for the others, other elected members. This is looking at the Mapua area T042. What are the implications for plan changes of areas being included in the FDS? Does this influence the outcome of a plan change process, i.e. make it more likely to be approved?
So through the mayor, could I just clarify, are you referring there to a council-led plan change or a private plan change?
A private plan change.
And it might be appropriate that Ms Anderson respond to that.
Thank you, Kerry. And Ms Barton, if you're familiar with the area that we were just discussing in terms of its constraints, if there's any further information we should have, then I'll come to you after that. Just wondering if Kerry is...
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I think, Councillor Sampson, your question was really what relevance an FDS has to a future plan change process. And the short answer is, under the NPS, it's required that the council has regard to it when doing plan changes. And have regard to simply means you take it into account and decide what weight to give to it.
Right, and Kerry, the follow-up, the clarification, Jackie asked Councillor Sampson, was she referring to a private plan change or a council plan change? And the answer was a private plan change. So is there any difference?
I'm just having a quick look on the words used in the FDS. No, it applies the same to both.
Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I think this leads on to my second question really is, has there been consistent consideration of iwi voice and values across the areas. So we've got the Maitai Valley with N106 and N032 included. Horoirangi, which obviously Wakatu have asked to be included, N290, which we have some additional relevant information coming to a Nelson City Council confidential meeting tomorrow. And then page 31, T042 Mapua, which has been included despite Te Atiawa concerns. And I just wonder, is there consistency of iwi voice and values across those three areas?
I'll go to the officers, but I'll also note that hopefully Aina is still with us. And so we did have expert advice through the panel process.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. And I did sit through that and I did hear her concerns raised around Mapua and the impact that the site.
I'll go to the officers, Councillor Sanson, thank you, and then Aina. Jackie, you might want to.
Thanks, Mary. So I'll just talk to the Mapua site. So just for clarification, it's as you mentioned, sections 4.24 to 4.26 of the report. This site was actually in the last FDS. It's been reassessed. It still scores well. We had a late indication of concerns of cultural heritage from Te Atiawa, which hadn't been known about before. But the slight complication with this site is that it's currently in the ownership of a consortium, which also includes a commercial arm of an iwi trust. And so we have talked about it with Te Atiawa, and we're looking at the national policy statement, which requires us to basically facilitate Māori aspirations for urban development. It doesn't distinguish between a commercial arm of an iwi trust or an iwi trust. It just literally says Māori tangata whenua aspirations for urban development. And therefore, at the moment, we've recommended that the site remains in because we wouldn't want to discriminate against another iwi, which is trying to facilitate development of that site.
Okay, thanks. That's great.
Yeah. Tēnā koe, Aina, is there anything further that you would like to add in relation to the assessment of iwi cultural values?
Tēnā koe, Madam Mayor, and tēnā koutou katoa i ngā rangatira, ko haina Kumirakara France taku ingoa te tauehu iwi representative. I'd just like to say now that I am a certified independent RMA commissioner. So in regards to furthering discussions for those sites of significance for iwi and mana whenua, there are discussions at the table, aren't there, Jackie, that you are forwarding. And in my understanding, you have a collaborative process in place with both councils in discussions with the actual chairs of Te Tauehu. So just covering off in terms of feedback and agreement from Te Tauehu, that certainly is in place. That evidence was in place. The discussions I had from my personal contact with Te Atiawa kaumātua at the site of Mapua on this particular occasion in the site visit, they were certainly, they were in agreement and also satisfied that there are positive communications and collaborations moving forward from both councils. But to my understanding, in regards to those Mapua sites in discussion at this particular time, I am in the understanding, and Jackie can confirm this based on the notes and based on what we've been speaking about thus far, that those discussions are continuous to come to conclusion with the mana whenua. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you. Any further questions, Councillor Sanson?
Just one more, thanks. And this is kind of a question of clarification, really. So on page 31, 4.27, there's a, it says, original residential capacity estimates covering Nelson City were informed by GIS data sources provided by Nelson City Council, which identified the urban built area and excluded land otherwise zoned for residential development or currently in the process of residential development. As such, not all existing development areas within Nelson were captured by either identified FDS areas or the broader residential infill areas, whereas in TDC they were. So what I'm wondering is, does that explanation mean that capacity in Nelson and existing and zoned residential areas could have been underestimated and is possibly larger than currently reported?
So,
thank you, Chris.
So through the Mayor, that refers to the original numbers that were put in the draft FDS document that went out for consultation that has since been corrected. So the numbers that are referred to in the deliberations report and what will be presented in the final FDS, that's all been adjusted to correct for that. It's really just a case of a difference in how the GIS layers were presented to the consultants.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Now, are there any other final comments from the officers? And then I'm going to move into debate. So any matters that the officers or consultants, legal team need to come back to? Ms. Barton, did you have anything to add in relation to the site in Nelson that was discussed earlier on?
So through the Mayor, just to reiterate what Chris had said, which was those sites that were being raised by Councillor Sampson have got geographical, geological, geotechnical constraints. So it was trying to recognise the fact of those existing constraints on that land.
All right, thank you. All right, we're now moving into debate. Councillor Girk, you've signalled you'd like to reserve would you like to reserve to right of reply, or would you like to speak and exercise the right of reply?
I can have the right of reply, but I'll speak now in support of the recommendation, and there's probably only just a couple of points I really want to make ourselves familiar with. And one is the purpose of the FDS, the proposal, and the process that was followed. It's probably useful to remind ourselves what is the purpose of this FDS, as we were reminded by our legal advisor. It's a high-level policy document to describe where the long-term growth should happen, and considering any constraints on that development. And we've heard about some already, the natural hazards, geotechnical issues, sea level rise, landscape protections, and more importantly, the highly productive land, which was a major consideration. It's important to remember too that the FDS is not a zone or a plan change document. It's not an urban planning strategy. It's not an urban. It's not a building design guide. It's not a guide as to character or amenity or as Chris mentioned before, it's not used to be a means of constraining or restricting the demand for housing. And that's what we're talking about, is housing. This FDS actually responds to the Housing and Business Development Capacity Assessment, the HBA, about the demand for and supply housing and business land for the needs of the region, both Nelson and Tasman, in the next 30 odd years. So it's important to remember what this document is: a high level policy document to guide where the growth should happen. And it then informs those strategic priorities that we have for a suite of other development related decisions, like the district plan and any plan changes that come along. The priority outcomes when we think about the infrastructure and strategies. The priorities and decisions we've made with things like the regional land development, land transport plan, and the regional public transport plan. Those sorts of documents follow on. The other point I would like to share is that the need for, it is a common urban environment that we're talking about. So we need to work collaboratively and jointly with both councils and come up, and we're jointly responsible for the preparation of this FDS. And it's basically is about the urban settlement patterns across the region. not Nelson, not Tasman, across the whole region. This is first part because we've got a long-term plan coming along, and this informs the long-term plan. To delay it does mean that we are non-compliant, and it does set us back in a very detrimental way about where we need to be in terms of compliance with the NPS and the work we need to do around the long-term plan and the planning that goes with that. Re-emphasise it is a living document, and you'll see one of the recommendations is it remains a standing item on the Joint Committee's agenda, and we can track progress in things like population growth, uptake rates, rates of intensification, all like that. So it always remains current. So it's not something that's locked into perpetuity and forgotten about. We can look at it and update as and when we need. I will also to talk about the process that we went along. And I have to say that consultation and engagement has been a fundamental part of this FDS process. I recall we did that round of pre-engagement probably late last year with various parties. And you'll recall that we had a session of early round of public feedback, I think last October at the beginning. Fundamental to this is that the need to also engage with infrastructure providers, developers and practitioners who are working in the region to help align with what the market is doing in this particular area, so growth is actually enabled. I've had engagement with iwi and hapu because that is an essential requirement that their reviews are reflected and incorporated in the plans. In March, when we opened up the FDS for the formal consultation process, we've heard that we've had something like 568 submissions, including 5 late ones by the time. And as being part of the subcommittee, I personally read every single submission, and I know that other members of the subcommittee did likewise. It was a mammoth task over a couple of weeks, but it was done. And the officers also report that at least 2 of them read each and every submission. 120 people presented their submissions via Zoom over a 4-day period at the end of April. And I think that the ability to people to Zoom in was much more convenient for a lot of submitters. And I think as consequently, we heard from a greater and wider range of submitters than what we would normally. I think that was probably one of the real advantages. You know, questions are asked, additional responses were sought from the officers, and in response to those submissions that were received. So I am totally confident that the subcommittee has a comprehensive, a thorough understanding of the views of the community and their aspirations. We carried out those deliberations, I think, over 3 days at the end of May, beginning of June, and the subcommittee has made its recommendations to this joint committee, and the joint committee have been asked to adopt the draft FDS. I think this joint committee can have trust and confidence that the subcommittee has heard from the community, is well informed on the views of the community, has considered the various scenarios and models and options. They've tested and scrutinised the expert advice, and that this FDS does actually fully and completely meet the legal requirements on the NPSUD. So for those reasons, I would commend that that you support the recommendations and adopt this FDS. And I'll leave it at that for the time being, let others speak.
Thank you, Councillor McGurk. I'll now go to Deputy Mayor Bryant and then Mayor King. And then I'll go to Councillor Sanson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So yeah, but Brian's covered it off very well with the process. I've just got a few comments to add. I believe this was one of the most fully and comprehensive processes I've been involved as a councillor in my time on council. From the whole time that the subcommittee was appointed by the joint committees. And I think, as Brian said, it was a very full and thorough process through the submissions. The 14 criteria that we assessed all the submissions against was very in-depth, and we spent a lot of time firstly going through that criteria and getting that in place, and then considering all the submissions. And as Brian said, I think pretty all the subcommittees read all the submissions, which is an important fact, rather than just those that spoke at the hearing, as the consideration of all submissions. And I think the deliberation process led by Mayor Rees was very thorough, and we had some thorough discussions around that, and have ended up where we have with a very positive FDS, in my view, for the future. I'd just like to acknowledge the work that the staff have done around that, particularly the teams behind that were led by Claire and Susan initially, and particularly Jackie and Chris from Nelson City Council. They had a huge effort right through that whole deliberation process, and always seemed to have the answers at their fingertips, so that was appreciated. And there's a whole team, of course, behind those people I've just talked about. And the subcommittee, I feel, and particularly Anga as well, really committed to the process and give it a thorough list of consideration that they could have with the information in front of them at the time. And I think the other thing to realise is that we talk about highly productive land, and that was part of the multi-priority assessment. But the real reason for doing this is for providing housing for people for the future. It was all about housing, housing, housing. And hopefully we'll get some multitudes of housing types in different areas across the region to get more people into homes that they can afford. So with that, thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bryant. I'll call on Mayor King.
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate the points that Councillor McGurk made at the start over what the future development strategy is and what it isn't, and the absolutely vital importance of following through with plan changes and the implementation plan that actually puts in place the ability, particularly around intensification. And I can't help but think this conversation might be a little different if post the 2019 FDS, that intensification plan change had been progressed and we'd seen more of that intensification development. I know I've been characterised as being opposed to intensification. Nothing could be further from the truth. I absolutely support intensification. I drive around Richmond and see the number of projects that are partway through completion, recently completed, or in the planning and construction and consenting stages, from Baitup Road to the CBD area to the area down by the two colleges, that, you know, it is great. It's great to see the fact that that's been done alongside and at the same time as the biggest greenfields development in the region, probably ever, in Richmond West, highlights to me that the two are not mutually exclusive. You can have both. They cater to different markets, different expectations and different requirements. But actually what we're demonstrating is with the right planning rules, the right encouragement and incentives, you can get both. I'd like to follow on from Councillor Bryant's or Deputy Mayor Bryant's comments around the hearing panel. This is an enormous bit of work. The staff, the consultant resources that have been put into it, the very, very thorough submissions that were received from a whole range of people from the general public in response to the FDS. It was always going to be impossible to satisfy everybody's requirements and expectations. And I think they've done a great job of arriving at a balanced set of recommendations which support the necessity of housing, which if you look at just about every strategic document produced in this region from central government through local government involved with iwi, housing sits at the absolute top of all the priorities that are identified in every single one of those strategic documents. So from my point of view, it's essential to have a balance. We're required to have a balance of housing types in a competitive land market. I was just reading the Minister of the Environment speech to local government, and it's very clear from that their RMA changes, their shift to the Natural and Built Environments Act, regional spatial strategies, the shift out of councils to regional planning committees and independent hearing panels is all designed to enable a much greater provision of housing at a faster rate than the current processes enable or allow for. And I think, ironically, this is probably the last time that councils in their current form, and all of us in this room and on Zoom, are going to have the degree of input into a final decision around future spatial planning. This is the last time. From now on, it's going to be independent panels. There may be a couple of representatives from each council on that, and a range of other people. They will recommend to an independent hearing panel, and they will recommend back to the Regional Planning Committee. And we will become advocates, influencers, inputters, but not decision makers in the future. So, look, I can only reiterate, I know not everyone's going to be satisfied with this. In a funny sort of way, these sort of documents almost inevitably end up not satisfying anybody, because they are trying to provide a degree of compromise and address a whole lot of really challenging and often conflicting requirements from central government and views within the community. But I genuinely believe the committee's done a great job. The council staff and the resources that have been supporting them through the consultants have provided absolutely mountains of information. And look, I'm only in a position really to be able to support the recommendations of the hearing panel. So I'm happy to support the resolution.
Thank you, Mayor King. Now we've had 3 speakers for. I'm not going to rule at 3-3 just yet, but I would like, if there are any speakers who are opposed, I'm just trying to manage our time a little bit better. So anyone speaking against the motion. So Councillor Sanson, Councillor, I'll start with you, and you can just indicate, and then I'll go to Councillor. If you're supporting, I'll go to Councillor Tufnell, and then Igara and Laurie.
Thanks very much, Madam Mayor, and I'm just calling a division on this. So
one's already been called earlier in the meeting.
Awesome, thanks. That's great. I missed that. Yeah, so I obviously am speaking against this. I do acknowledge, and I did earlier in my questions, the work that the staff, the officers, and the subcommittee have done in reaching this point. However, I am really concerned that the underlying assumptions that this strategy is based on are flawed. We had this week Al Gore say we're seeing a global emergency play out. It's getting worse more quickly than was predicted. We have got to step up. This should be a moment for a global epiphany. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres this week, in response to fires and floods across the world, says half of humanity is in the danger zone. From floods, droughts, extreme storms and wildfires, no nation is immune, yet we continue to feed our fossil fuel addiction. We have a choice, collective action or collective suicide. It is in our hands. And I think that really points to what I see as kind of the key flaw in the strategy where it has landed, is not, looking at how we can meet capacity for high growth, but really, should we be continuing to grow endlessly? Like, to me, it seems like a business as usual approach to a existential issue that we're facing. And I know, like everybody around this table, housing is key, but we are not, in my view, we're not addressing the kinds of housing that we really need to meet the needs in our community, which is lower income families, lower income people in our community, smaller, young people, smaller housing types. This strategy doesn't really, in my view, significantly expand on that. Instead, we are going for, really greenfield expansion above all else. And at the expense of the environment. The strategy is almost silent on this, acknowledging that we're not meeting our carbon emissions reduction targets, so I am really sorry. I don't like to be going against the work of the officers, but I'm, my concerns that I've raised throughout this remain. I know that they are shared by a significant proportion of the community, from reading the submissions and sitting through the hearings and listening to the deliberations. So I'm going to be voting against this.
Thank you, Councillor Sanson. Now just check with Councillor Tufnell and Edgar. Are you speaking for or against the motion?
Tufnell speaking for.
All right, and Councillor Edgar for, and Councillor Laurie
Against.
All right, I'll take someone against. I'll do 3 against, and then we'll see how we go.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Like Councillor Sanson, I have huge respect for the staff and the consultants and the elected representatives who have got us to this stage. It's been a huge amount of work. It's been a huge amount of reading. It's been a huge amount of energy. It's been massive mahi, and I thank all of you for that work. Like Councillor Sanson, I have some really deep reservations about the strategy, however. We heard at the start of this meeting that the job of the FDS is to figure out how we're going to achieve well-functioning urban environments in existing and future urban areas. These are noble goals, but I do not believe that a plan that relies on 54% greenfield development is going to do that. At 54% greenfield development, this strategy is too wedded to urban sprawl, a form of development that, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people in our region, belongs to the 20th century, not the 21st century. I agree with Nelson Tasman 2050. I agree with their concerns when they say that the strategy lacks vision at a time when bold action is needed, that it fails to achieve sufficient emissions reductions by allowing more urban sprawl that hinders the viability of quality intensification, and urban sprawl that does not provide the right conditions for the creation of vibrant, regenerative, and livable neighbourhoods. I heard a great quote the other day: "Nothing changes if nothing changes." And for me, I do not believe that this FDS, I wish it did, but for me, I do not believe that this FDS will deliver the level of change that our communities need, that our region needs. I don't think it's going to make our districts more livable. In fact, I think it will make parts of our districts less livable, and I believe it's going to lead to more people who live in our part of the world being more dependent on privately owned motor vehicles, which I don't think is going to help us in any way. I think it's going to add, unfortunately, to the obesogenic environment that we have already created, that we need to start taking apart, and we need to start doing it quickly. I think in time, I'm sad to say, that I think what we're doing right now, what we're, I think, going to adopt will be seen as a missed opportunity. And I fully expect that in 3 years' time, these concerns that I'm expressing and that Councillor Sanson expressed, and I think we're going to hear from others expressing these concerns will be raised again. The voices that will be raising them will be greater in number, and the volume will be louder as well. And I really hope that the people who have been submitting and talking to us and emailing us, calling for a more sustainable future, are not put off by this FDS being adopted today. I hope that somehow they get energy out of it and they keep coming back to us and they keep telling us how we can do better, because I believe we have to do better. And I really think we need to hear those voices. So to those people out there who've pushed a sustainable future for Nelson and Tasman, I say kia kaha, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Councillor Laurie. I'll now go to Councillor O'Neill Stevens, just to check, you speaking for the motion or against the motion?
Against.
Thank you.
Ngā mihi, Madam Mayor. As a young person and as someone who doesn't own a home, it's quite easy to feel a bit like a tennis ball in these discussions just being sort of whacked back and forth as a convenient line whenever it's necessary. And I mean, we're all aware that we're facing a housing crisis. And when we speak of this, we do primarily speak about that through that lens of housing affordability and how it's impacting people. But I think the reality is that we're facing a crisis much larger than that, a crisis of urban design, a crisis of land use, of climate change, and of happiness and connection. And what we've got in front of us, the future development strategy and these policy recommendations, should serve as a key part of our plan out of it. I voted against the draft future development strategy with the knowledge of exactly what Mr. Wakefield presented today, that the initial proposal would ultimately be a key limiting factor on what the final FDS could look like. And my view then, and my view now, but now supported by many of the submissions, was that we've lowballed our intensification and we haven't taken the opportunity to show bold vision. Not necessarily in terms of the expected uptake rate, but in the locations and scale of intensification within our urban area, and that we haven't taken a strong enough stand in moving towards evidence-based models of successful urban areas. And I believe that that really comes down to the fact that we've looked at the FDS as a challenge, and the way we've discussed it reflects this, when we should have been looking at the FDS as an opportunity to provide that framework for our future, and the opportunity to have discussed the fundamentals of urban design and growth and what that looks like in a climate positive, happy and successful region. And because of that, I think we've missed the opportunity to truly change direction from the road we've been slowly trundling along for the last 50 years. You know, not to fight against population growth or all greenfield development, but to imagine communities which are connected and community-based, that have the numbers of people living in them to genuinely be walkable, that are mixed use, that are safe and well supported. And I mean, I worry about the long-term financial viability of many of the envisioned forms of developments. You know, we know that the wider our rate space is spread, the greater the cost on our community to upkeep the infrastructure and community wants and needs. Just finally, on the minutiae of what's in front of us, I think there are some fundamental issues in some of the policy recommendations today. Climate action and providing enough housing for our people are not at all contradictory. In fact, they're fundamentally interwoven. You know, the fabric of our city shapes people's decisions and shapes the scale of their emissions. There's a huge evidence base for the intensified city providing lower carbon footprints for its people. And I think the assumptions around the relationship between greenfield development and intensification don't align with many of the expert submissions or the broader evidence base I've seen. And again, like Councillor Sampson and Councillor Laurie, I do really want to acknowledge the work of both staff and the work of the subcommittee in considering what has been a huge amount of material. And you know, the reason I'm voting against this isn't the fault of a lack of work or a lack of process. And I'd agree with Councillor McGurk and I think it was Deputy Mayor Bryant. This has been a very thorough process. But I think what we've had is a failure at a governance level to truly engage with the real challenges and the potential that they offer us into the future to move away from the status quo. And so I am voting against this because fundamentally, I believe we can do better.
Thank you, Councillor Neil Stevens. Now I'm going to stop with the hands on the screen. I'm not seeing anyone else in the room at the moment, so I'm going to stop. Councillor Wonga, well, then I might have to rule because I'm really conscious that we have to be very quick debates if we're going to keep going. Otherwise, I'm going to rule we're done as chair. So if we can keep them to very quick debates, I will go to Councillor check. Councillor Green, are you speaking for or against? I think I've had 3 now. 1, 2, 3.
I'm against, so you may want to go
All
to
right.
the fours.
All right. Well, if Councillor Tufnell doesn't mind, what I'm going to do is go Councillor Green and Councillor Tufnell, Councillor McNamara, and then Councillor Egger, and then there'll be the right to reply. Oh, sorry, Councillor Mackenzie. All right, you're going to be all right, we'll keep going.
Okay, so I've indicated that I'm not supportive of this, and I really want to explain why. And I want to start off with the opening words from the advice given this morning, which was, this is not a rubber stamping exercise. And I also want to take on the words of Councillor McGurk, because I think he's framed it well, although maybe my concern is where it's landed. This is about where long-term growth should happen. It should reflect the aspirations of our community. We are interposed in this process to reflect the aspirations of our community. We live in an outstanding landscape. We have the opportunity to enhance it and protect it, not build over it. Here is our opportunity as governance to set out a vision for our community, one that our community actually wants, but this FDS is not reflecting it. Councillor Bryant spoke about housing, and I really want to respond to that. I don't think doing more and more greenfield development, which is what this is really proposing, especially in Tasman, which is far higher than the 54%, I think it's nearly approaching 70, will achieve. We have already seen a massive amount of greenfield development in Richmond, more than actually staff recommended at the time. That's a majority of councillors supported it. That has not brought housing prices down. And I think if you think that all this greenfield development is going to deliver that, I think you'll be bitterly disappointed. Councillor King mentioned, opening up more greenfields and it won't undermine intensification. Of course it will. History shows quite clearly that all the land that gets opened up, which is easy to develop, will go to first, and that will be the greenfields. And I do think we really have not seen intensification in Tasman. We've seen more infill, and perhaps we're confusing infill with intensification. I think this FDS is fundamentally flawed. It's built on a logic loop. It's built on flawed foundations and assumptions. It's failed to address the community concern of urban sprawl, which is a governance group we should really be aspiring to reduce, but we are actually providing the framework to encourage it. That's only going to be, as we have seen in Tasman, a recipe for greater infrastructural costs that will come downstream, and an environment that is fully recognised by some other speakers, less livable. We're already seeing that congestion in Richmond already from opening up vast swathes of greenfield development in very large blocks, far larger than Tasman Council could even cope with. Land in Richmond South, that rural one land, a commissioner has declined its development because it was rural one land. The government didn't support it for development of rural one land. I still don't know why someone who bought a dam share and wanted to use it for agriculture now suddenly wants to develop it. And we're going to encourage that loss of land and basically usurp someone who looked at those land development opportunities and said, no, this is not appropriate in that area. I think that is a flaw of this FDS. The FDS is, again, based on some growth assumptions, which I think are flawed and have been self-fulfilling. It's built on probably Tasman opening up large swathes of greenfield development in the past that has basically created an environment where we have, as the NRD have already pointed out in their more recent documents, imported a large sway of retirees into the area. You know, you open it up and they will come. We don't need to do that. We don't need to do that. What we need to do is look towards shifting, which is what we really should be directing ourselves towards, shifting the focus towards more intensification, and you will not get it from opening up all this greenfield development.
Thank you. I'll move on now to Councillor, thank you, Councillor Greening. I'll move on now to Councillor Tufnell.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I think we all are very much aware we are changing, we are intensifying. And what we have in front of us today is a very comprehensive report on what I would describe as a controlled growth, a strategic plan which will continually be under review. And I know, as well as anybody else in the room, is that there are people who will have differing opinions, but for me, I'm happy for us to move on this one on the basis, as I said previously, that the plan will be continually under review. Happy to support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Tufnell. Councillor McNamara.
Thank you. So we've heard about the importance of the FDS and what it's designed to do, and it's all about town planning and all the rest of it. But it's constantly being undermined by private plan changes and government lolly scrambles, like with the Shah debacle. So I question that it is as important as it's made out to be. I'm told that it's a living document, but we can't change areas that were set aside in the 2016 plan because we've already signalled them. I would suggest that the population growth modelling is backward-looking data, and it's not current. It's not what's happening today. If you look around the world, you'll actually discover that we don't have a housing crisis, as has been described, that actually housing prices are starting to drop and it's getting harder to shift houses because of high interest rates and what have you, flushing all the excess houses out of the woodwork. So I don't think the modelling is as accurate as it could be, and I don't agree with the way we have weighted highly productive land versus less highly productive land in the outer regions. So I can't support it.
I'll now go to Councillor McKenzie, and then I will cross to Councillor Ecker, who is a member of the hearings panel. I'd like to give her an opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, through you, Madam Mayor. So I do want to acknowledge the work of staff, and I also want to acknowledge the time and effort that the submitters have put in. And I also just want to acknowledge the very large number of emails that I've personally received. I want to make a comment particularly with respect to Mapua. And, you know, I just want to think about the importance of the structure plan that we intend to do for Mapua. There is a community that's very concerned about the way that development occurs. They want to think about how they walk and cycle around their district. They're concerned about transport, their natural spaces and reserves, sea level rise and emissions. And I really think that we've got a big job ahead of us in terms of how we interact with that community to work on the structure plan. Look, I hate to see the consumption of highly productive land. I really do. It does concern me. But equally, we're in a terrible state in terms of our housing. And in a way, it's not just housing affordability. I'm thinking about all those people who actually don't have homes. And that's something that as a society we really need to get on top of. I am mindful of the economists actually at Infometrics who quite often say on the webinars that I tune into that land availability is actually the biggest driver of the cost of land. So I think that's important. I don't think the national policy statement on urban development allows us to reject growth. I think that, you know, it's growth that's going to happen unless you can curb the population at large. And you know, it's actually about how we choose to live. I did ask the question in terms of the FDS, does it in itself actually lock in anything? The answer I've had is no. What's important is the actual work under the RMA on the plan changes. And so we need to make sure that we get as much community input into those as possible. So, you know, there are aspects of the FDS that don't sit comfortably with me, but taken as a whole package, I feel that I need to support the recommendation of the hearing panel of the subcommittee. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mackenzie. I'll go to Councillor Eager.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, just want to address a few comments that were made. Apologies if I repeat some comments that have been made. Just there's been a lot of comment about the aspirations or the views of our community, but we need to be really clear that, you know, these aren't an absolute. And there was a housing preferences survey that was undertaken, and that was reported on in the 31 May report and previously to council. And as you'd see, the aspirations are for other people to live in intensified areas. A minority of people were aspiring to live in intensified housing themselves. A majority wanted to keep having their housing as they wanted it. However, people were aspiring for other people to live in housing that they themselves didn't want to live in. And that was borne out through the submissions when you asked people, and we had people who said, yep, we used to live in intensified housing. It was horrible. We now live in a large lifestyle block, but we really support intensified housing for other people. So I'm sorry, but that just reeks of a lot of privilege to me, that people with lots of houses, lots of land mass are going, that's where other people can live. Now, that being said, I actually wouldn't mind living in intensified housing myself. I'm one of those people who said, yes, I would if I could afford it when I did the housing preferences survey. But actually, I can't afford to live in intensified housing. I can't afford those apartments. And so for people who are wanting smaller houses, lower cost housing, etc., then buying, you know, the large 4 bedrooms that older people are shifting out of isn't actually one of the options either. And so they do need some of the options that greenfield or infill is going to provide, which is why we can't do one size fits all. And I think sometimes greenfield has, you know, that quarter acre white picket fence ideation around it. And that's why we've tried to be really clear in this FDS that greenfield does not mean large quarter acre sections. Greenfield gives the ability to look at communal housing sections. It gives the ability to look at co-housing and look at intergenerational housing. It gives the ability to look at all those different types of shared models that you can't necessarily do by putting one small thing into someone's backyard or clearing one house and putting in a couple of apartments or doing a large, you know, 6-story development somewhere. So we do need to make sure that we are thinking of everyone regardless of their price point, because we know regardless of reducing house prices, that there are people living in cars. There are people living in really gross and disgusting conditions in rental accommodation. And I know there is legislation that currently says they shouldn't be, but people are too scared to say you're not meeting those new standards because they can't afford to go anywhere else. So they will accept the only housing they have. And as someone who has lived in properties that have been, you know, little more than shoeboxes, who has lived in boarding houses, who has been homeless for a while, I do understand the pressures. Yes, it has been a while since that has been me, but that is beside the point. I understand some of the pressures that people go through, and we need to make sure we are reflecting them and that we are listening to them as well. And that is part of our role. So the other comment I will just make is on what we've got in front of us. And yep, look, there's been over 6,000 pages we've read, 568 submissions, 120 verbal, but also what may be missed is that there has actually been a lot of changes from what has gone out. And I think unless you have potentially, you know, sort of lived and breathed this as much as, you know, the committee did, noting some of those changes could be very easily missed. A councillor at the start said, you know, that this was quite hard to get their head around. And so I acknowledge that. But there have been a lot of changes, and a lot of changes that could result in some good outcomes. But that being said, the FDS is actually the start of the process. It's not the end game. We've still got neighbourhood plans, housing choice plan changes, annual implementation plans, infrastructure strategies, LTPs, etc., that then fall out of this. The richness of what is developed up on the basis of this comes from those documents. And so, you know, they will help determine the change, because, you know, we've heard people saying, you know, we need more happening in Wakefield and Brightwater, which is exactly why we made sure there was business zoned land there. So those people might have a chance of walking to work, cycling to work. But the bus system is already extending beyond there. So with regards to climate change emissions, yes, transportation is a key emitter, absolutely. But it's not the only thing we're doing. And we're sort of talking about this like it's the only thing we're going to be doing to reduce emissions. And it's not. And I think having people being able to work near where they live is a critical part of it, because we can't literally fit everyone into our CBDs and have no one out in the country. That's not realistic. But what's realistic is making sure we are supporting those emissions, which is what this is a piece of doing. Our public transport plan is another piece. Our roading strategies are other pieces. Our active transport strategies are other pieces, etc., etc. I'm not going to list everything. So, look, I'll leave it at that. I think this document isn't as disappointing as people think it is. I think some people, and we saw it in submissions, where they think this document is more than what it actually is. You know, this is a roadmap. It isn't every stop along the way. It doesn't deliver up on all of it. But actually, if nothing else, it can help on setting things in the right direction. And then those other processes I talked about can start honing and start supporting greater intensification, start supporting affordability of housing, start supporting, you know, we made sure that Queen Street and our central city, Nelson and Motueka, had opportunities to develop in the city centres themselves, for example. This doesn't deliver that, and councils don't deliver that. But hopefully this enables other people to do that. That will do. Thank you very much. And thank you again to Ina and to the rest of the committee for their mahi, and to the staff and submitters. Kia ora.
Thank you, Councillor Ika. Councillor McGurk, would you like to exercise your right of reply before we take the division?
Yeah, just very, very quickly, Madam Mayor, and through you. Just in response to some of the comments that have been made, is that I would say is that the lack of housing is acting as a constraint on the prosperity of our region in terms of where people can live or choose to live or move here. So yeah, lack of housing is a constraint on the prosperity of our region. Some of the speakers I made it very clear what the FDS was and what it wasn't, and some of the speakers sort of strayed into the area of urban design and choices and typology and things like that. That's not what the FDS is about. It's important to remember that this is a high-level document about how we will handle growth in our region. The population is increasing. People choose to come to the Nelson Tasman region for a variety of reasons, and we need to accommodate that. The debate around the greenfield and brownfield development is often framed as sort of a binary argument, a binary choice. There's nothing in this FDS that prevents intensification and brownfield development. But there is a recognition that brownfield intensification is not going to cope with all the growth and all the choices that are required. So there has to be an alternative. But there's nothing to stop landowners and property developers from developing, intensive houses in existing urban environment, and I encourage them to do that. This is a beginning of a journey, a beginning of a document. There's a lot that flows out of it, as other speakers have said. I would encourage the elected members to support the FDS, and I'll leave it at that. I'd like to acknowledge the officers, acknowledge the consultants, acknowledge the fellow members of the subcommittee for the work that has gone on. It has been a massive amount of work. It's been a long journey, and thank you for that. So I'll leave it at that, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor McGurk. Now, a division's been called, so we'll commence the division. There are a few matters that I'll need to address after the vote, so don't all disappear straight away.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Deputy Mayor Edgar.
4.
Deputy Mayor Bryant.
4.
Councillor Butler.
4.
Councillor Bowater.
4.
Councillor Dowler.
4.
Councillor Brand.
4.
Councillor Courtney.
4.
Councillor Greening.
Against.
Councillor Hill.
4.
Councillor Fulton.
Aye.
Councillor Laurie.
Against.
Councillor Mackenzie.
4.
Councillor McNamara.
Against.
Councillor McGurk.
4.
Councillor O'Neill-Stevens.
Against.
Councillor Mayling.
4.
Councillor Ogilvie.
4.
Councillor Rainey.
Against.
Councillor Sanson.
Which I think
Against.
that part of the presentation, Rachel. So in a way,
Did you catch me?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the other person to stop talking. Councillor Tufnell.
4.
Councillor Turley.
4.
Councillor Skinner.
4.
Mayor King.
4.
Mayor Rees.
4.
Lost.
Carried.
Sorry, sorry. Carried. I was just joking.
Kia ora, Robert. It has been a long afternoon, but thank you very much. So that is carried, 18 votes for, 6 against. And I want to spend a couple of moments. We've finished with the item, but I today. First thing I want to do is just note that this matter needs to come back. So today, remember that it's coming back to the Joint Committee again for the final adoption. So just a reminder about that matter. So that is on the 29th of August, I believe, is the date. Just check that I've got that right. Yes, it is 29th of August. So we will make sure that we have those documents out to you, a bit of work just to compile them all, and they'll be coming back to the Joint Committee. I want to acknowledge, I know she is still with us, and I want to say thank you to you so much, Ngā mihi nui. You have been a really valuable part of our FDS process, and I just want to say that as a chairing the panel, I want to thank you for your contribution. I know the panel members, we acknowledged at the end of our subcommittee meeting the value that you brought to the process and the learning that we benefit from. So thank you, and congratulations on becoming a resource consent commissioner. It's as those of us who are qualified commissioners know, it's a reasonably big task to work through that that first accreditation process, but I wish you well in your future endeavours with that commissioner work. And again, just thank you so much for the value of your contribution to our region on behalf of the iwi of Te Tauihu. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Madam Chair. Tēnā koutou katoa i ngā rangatira. Thank you, much appreciated. It was an absolute honour. Absolute honour. Kia ora.
Thank you. Kia ora. Just in closing, I want to acknowledge that it has been in the debate today, the contribution of all of the staff that make it possible for us to do this work. I think sometimes we perhaps underestimate the amount of work that goes on behind the scenes to make these projects come to fruition. We've had staff that have worked through weekends, they've worked through till 2, till 3, till 4 o'clock in the morning and got up and started again the next day. And I just want to acknowledge all of the staff. I want to acknowledge the consultants who are there, who have also supported this project, and it has been an iterative project. It had the questioning, the sense checking, the peer review. It has been a robust process. And so thank you to the elected members who did acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge the support team that are sitting alongside me to my left, and actually all of your colleagues that have been here throughout the process, whether that's been putting together and compiling submissions, responding to submitters that wanted to come and speak to us, being here to take minutes, coordinating agendas, keeping the panel on check and on track as much as you can, which is always a difficult task for the elected members. But thank you very, very much for all of your work. To the elected members, look, there was a lot that went into this. I think fundamentally, this is a guiding document, and now, as many of you said, it's up to the councils actually to bring the opportunity to fruition. I certainly don't take a negative mindset about this work, and I've listened to some of the commentary today, and I hope that when you have some more time actually to reflect on what you're seeing and the opportunities, and you start to see them come to fruition, you'll feel, those of you that you couldn't support this today, you'll feel more positively about what an amazing opportunities in front of you. And Dwayne gave a little nod to that a bit earlier on, actually about the role that councils can play in terms of, I call it aggregation. Dwayne, you've got another word that you use for it, I forget what it is. Land assembly. So let's see what role we can play in the future, but it's going to require a proactive, very positive approach to the opportunity. Growth is here, and I know for those of you that come from a perspective where growth might not be something that you support, I guess one of the slides that I reflected on at the Local Government Commission, Local Government New Zealand conference was actually, how are we going to grow in the future? And the demographics for our region are no different than any other part of New Zealand. If we look at our younger generations, we're going to see a growth in our Māori population. We're going to see a greater need for housing for Māori. And I want to just reflect on some of the other hearings that have been going on this week, and I think it's something that we need to be very, very mindful of. When we make our decisions around our council tables, please, please, and I say this to those of you who will be here for the future, do not disenfranchise those who have been disenfranchised over generations. You really have a responsibility as tupuna pono, as good to be good ancestors. And I think you've set this in the right direction today. So thank you very much. Panel members, thank you again. Real pleasure to work with all of you, and I think we're ready now to close today's hearing. Mayor King, I want to acknowledge you. It's actually quite a tough call as a mayor not to sit in the panel as much as the work. It's a big workload. Actually, I know that you haven't switched off from this process all the way through, so I just want to thank you for your generosity in allowing me to chair this process on behalf of both councils. Kia ora, and I'll invite you to close today with karakia.
Thank you. It was actually a relatively easy give to let you chair today's meeting, to be fair. It's not something that I look forward to. I think you did a great job, and I just acknowledge everyone's contribution. I know this is something that really does have some strong opinions attached to it, and I'm not sure there's right and wrong answers in this space. There are good and bad decisions potentially, but not right and wrong answers. And increasingly, I guess all the challenges that we face collectively, there's no black and white, there's no simple, easy, one size fits all way of addressing them. And this fits right into that category. So thanks for sharing today. Appreciate you. Welcome to our chamber. Kua mutu amato mahi no tenewa, manaki mato ho amato whanu katoa, au ki te aorangi e tau mai ana, kia hiki te korero, kia watia, kia mamata manawa o te tangata.
Kia ora. Thank you, Mayor King. Thank you everyone for your attendance, and we'll close today, and I'm going to make it hopefully to Marae Committee on time. Kia ora.
Kia ora everyone. Thanks, Rachel.